Chapter 1270. What should we do? Insursta was a little confused. They couldn't possibly fire at the port. Gussel was under the joint rule of the three necromancers. Although they didn't live in the port, there were still their servants and servants stationed in the port. Moreover, in the far eastern region of Madara, although the necromancers here were nominally under the will of the Mercury staff, the Empire's influence here was far less powerful than imagined. Otherwise, he and Tarkus wouldn't have been sent to this place. To make matters worse, there weren't enough mid-tier necromancers on the two ships. They couldn't even send out sampans for reconnaissance. Can you still feel the breath of life? Both Insursta and Tarkus nodded. Let's go ashore and take a look, Brando replied. Although the port looked very strange, he was confident that with his current strength, he wouldn't encounter any trouble in this place. Naturally, it was impossible for three ships to enter the harbor if they wanted to go ashore. Of course, it wasn't impossible. Corsel was an excellent deep-water harbor, and it wouldn't be a problem for them to dock a few medium-sized sailboats. However, this harbor didn't seem as safe and reliable as they had imagined. If the ships were trapped here, they wouldn't be able to escape even if they encountered any problems. No one present was stupid, and they naturally understood this. Tarkus ordered two ships to lower their anchors, and the remaining ship of the Phantom Chariot drifted outside the port, waiting for an opportunity to move. The sailors on the ship had been replaced by Tarkus, and the captives of the Phantom Chariot were also imprisoned on another ship. Therefore, it wasn't wrong to call it the Ship of the Undead. Soon, 5 sampans were lowered from the side of the ship. In fact, there wasn't a need for so many ships because only Brando, Insursta, and Mr. Lu were going ashore. There was still a need for one person to command the ship, and one expert to prevent accidents. The person in charge of command was naturally Tarkus, who was the calmest of all, and it was one of Brando's strategies to separate him from Insursta. The expert left behind was Brando. After all, other than Brando, there was no one else in the fleet who was more advanced than the vice-marshal of the Allied forces. However, at the last moment, Tarkus, who had been a little quiet, arranged for another 2 ships, which were filled with more than 30 low-level skeletons. Although there were no necromancers, Insursta could always personally command some low-level undead. The situation at the port was really strange and cannon fodder was always needed. When they were about to board the ship, Adni and her subordinates came over and said that they wanted to disembark with them. Although it was a little unexpected, these people were all above elemental activation, and even had the strength of the elemental enlightenment. They also called themselves mercenaries, so Brando was naturally happy to have more people. He understood what these people meant, and since they were not short of money anyway after promising a generous reward, these people asked for another 2 sampans. Finally, when the skeleton oarsmen began to row, the sampans slowly moved away from the fleet that was docked outside the bay and sailed towards the port of Gussel. There were 2 more people on the ship that Brando and the others were on. One of them was Huanghua. The little girl had boarded the ship with the excuse that she wanted to follow her teacher. Considering that the latter's personal strength was not bad, Brando agreed to her request. In fact, he originally wanted to test the little girl's courage. As a warrior, she could always hide in the back, and this princess of the Jade Phoenix family did not disappoint him. As for the other person, he was sitting directly opposite Brando, staring at him. He was dressed in fine clothes, and his long black hair hung down to his shoulders. If Brando did not know what he was here for, he might have thought that he was out for an outing. It was the genius of the Ghost Chariot clan that appeared once in 1,000 years, Mr. Feng Qi. Naturally, this person did not volunteer to board the ship, nor did he call himself a mercenary like Adni and the others. In fact, he had been under house arrest on the ship, so that the elders of the Phantom Chariot could not act against him. After all, it was not that easy to imprison a few people who were at the peak of the law and were close to supreme class. And now that he was here, it was Delphian's idea. Brando knew that the Prime Minister's daughter wanted this person to understand his current situation, so that it would be easier to carry out the next step of the plan. During his conversation with Delphian during dinner, he had a general understanding of what the riddle of the emerald was. Although the Prime Minister's daughter had stolen information related to it from the Rosaline family, finding the stagnation realm and obtaining the heart of the Jade Dragon was not as simple as solving the riddle of the Emerald Dragon. Moreover, solving the riddle of the emerald itself was not simple. The 5 sampans slowly rowed in the direction of Port Gussel. The dark clouds in the sky still covered the silver moon, Timmy's, and the white moon, Kohua. It was pitch black all around, and only the monotonous sound of water could be heard in the darkness. That was the sound of oars entering the water. The pitch-black port ahead was like a giant mouth, causing one's hair to stand on end when looking in that direction. Brando, Insursta, and the others were fine, but Huang Hua's little face was rather pale. She clenched her sword in her small hand so tightly that her knuckles turned pale. As a young girl who had yet to experience the world, her calmness when facing enemies was already surprising enough, but in the face of the unknown darkness she was only 10 years old after all. How could she not be afraid of the dark? She subconsciously leaned towards Brando, as if this amazing teacher could give her some comfort. Who would have thought that the heir of the Jade Phoenix bloodline, my dear little cousin, would actually be afraid of the dark? Mr. Genius of the Phantom Chariot bloodline, who was sitting across from Brando, could not help but speak when he saw this scene. I'm not afraid, Huang Hua replied in a huff, trembling with anger. Is that so? Is it fun to bicker with a child? Mr. Lu interrupted the two. Fang Qi shrugged and a jade pot and jade cup appeared out of nowhere. Do you want to drink some wine to boost your courage? I used to do that when I was young. Brendel was a little speechless as he looked at this scene. Is this Ghost Chariot clan's once-in-a-thousand-years genius talking about being funny? Does this guy even understand the situation he's in? Sure enough, Mr. Lu coldly blocked him with the hilt of his sword. Don't give wine to a child. Fang Qi shrugged again. However, he quickly became interested in Brando again. He looked up and down at Brando and said, I wonder what Miss Delphian likes about you. When Brando heard this, he almost spat out a mouthful of blood. He never dreamed that someone would be jealous of him for a woman whose insides were probably all black. If it were not for the fact that the other party was a summoned creature of the Dead Moon card deck, he would not have dared to get within 10 steps of Delphian. Otherwise, who knew when he would be schemed against? He couldn't help but take a closer look at this guy, trying to figure out where this idiot's courage came from. Could it be that he had been fooled by Delphine and had become stupid? Is Miss Delphian really your fiancée? It doesn't look like it. You're Brando, right? Are you a noble from the West? I heard that the people there are all country bumpkins. Is that true? To be honest, I don't think you are good enough for Miss Delphian. How about this? I want to duel with you. If you lose, you have to give Miss Delphian to me. Is that okay? Pfft. Huang Hua couldn't help but burst out laughing. She blushed and covered her mouth, thinking that she was being too rude. Mr. Lu looked straight ahead and pretended not to see this scene. Shut up, Brando said, unable to take it anymore. However, at this moment his expression suddenly changed. He turned his head and looked down into the dark sea. Other than Huang Hua, who reacted a little slower, Insursta Dragon and Mr. Lu stood up at the same time. With a sharp clang, the two of them unsheathed their long swords. Careful, there is something under the water. 5 sampans were distributed in a wedge-shaped formation in the bay. The 2 undead cannon fodder boats were at the front, followed by the boats of the self-proclaimed mercenaries Adeline and the others. At this moment, the shout came from the other side almost immediately. Brando could not help but think highly of these mercenaries. Their alertness was outstanding. But what surprised him even more was Fang Qi's reaction. The genius of the chariot ghost, who appeared once in 1,000 years, had a funny look on his face earlier, but unexpectedly, his reaction was the fastest among everyone. Insursta and Mr. Lu had only noticed the abnormality under the water, but this guy not only had a long sword in his hand, but also turned to look in the right direction. When he noticed this detail, Brando realized that Fang Qi's reputation as a genius was not undeserved. In fact, when Fang Qi made his move, he noticed that Fang Qi's strength was much higher than Huang Hua's. He was almost catching up with Mr. Lu. The difference in age between the three of them was quite big. However, it was almost certain that this guy should also be a chosen one. It was normal for a chosen one to have some flaws. However, what made Brando feel a little strange was that he could not see any flaws in Huang Hua's body. Judging from her potential level, she should at least be a chosen one. This thought only flashed through his mind for a moment, and he quickly looked forward. While looking in that direction, he stretched out his hand. 2 bright golden lines intertwined in the darkness, and the flaming blade Odorfice appeared in his hand. P.S. Delphian's card will be released tomorrow. Hee, it should be the unapproachable Fergie card. Chapter 1271. A huge wave surged out of the darkness. Brando held Odorfice in his hand and frowned when he saw the 100-meter-wide wave that connected the east and west ends of the bay. The wave was at least 6 to 7 meters tall. Wherever it passed, the ships in the port would be pushed back. The dense forest of masts rose and fell one after another like a pine tree. It was not something that his little dinghies could resist. Fly! Brando shouted to the others. At the same time, he grabbed Insursta by the collar and flew up from the ship. He could use his elemental force to stabilize the ship, but there was no need for that. Lowering the sampans to the shore was to not attract the attention of the people in the harbor. But now that the other party had discovered them, there was no need to lie to himself and others. Besides, he still had no idea what was under the water. Mr. Lu, Huanghua, and Fang Qi followed closely behind him. In Wand, as long as one had the strength of an elemental force, one could temporarily stay in the air. After reaching the supreme realm, one could even fly. Insursta was the only one present who did not have this strength. Insursta could not help but curse in his heart, thinking that he was really unlucky. He and Brando should not have come out this time, but he knew that White Tower's Gus's fleet was much more reliable than his. As soon as Brando rose into the air, Adney's reaction was not slow either. Two Knight grabbed Quill and the others rose into the air. In the end, only the skeletal cannon fodder from the two boats remained on the surface of the water. As the huge waves came crashing down, the skeletal sailors were at a loss as to what to do. The seawater came crashing down, and the few sampans spun around like leaves in the waves before capsizing. In the blink of an eye, these cannon fodder had completed their mission. On the pitch-black surface of the sea, a white wave slowly swept past their feet, pushing the 5 overturned sampans out of the bay. At this moment, Brando saw what seemed to be a shadow swimming under the waves. With a boom, it flew up from the surface of the sea, carrying thousands of tons of seawater with it as it rushed towards the people in the air. Be careful. Damn it, it's coming again. There was a cacophony of shouts in the darkness. Enter the harbor. Brando looked at this scene without a change in expression and ordered the others at the same time. His calm voice made the others come back to their senses. The knights of the Ra's Feather Knight Regiment were stunned. They instantly restored their order and immediately turned to fly in the direction of the port. Their orderly behavior attracted Brendel's attention. It was rare to see such a well-trained mercenary even in White City. But even in White City, there shouldn't be a single elemental tier mercenary, right? It wasn't that he didn't suspect the identity of these people, but he didn't put their strength in his eyes. Anyway, from the looks of it, he had picked up a big bargain. You guys go first. Brando turned his head. His voice was somewhat insignificant in the rumbling sound of the water. The wall of water was almost in front of him, and the height of 20 to 30 meters made it almost like a small tsunami. The strong wind blowing against his face made Brendel's long hair dance wildly. Teacher? Huanghua was a little hesitant, but Mr. Lu was behind her. The latter dragged her back. He knew very well that the others would only be a burden to Brando if they stayed here. Before reaching the Supreme Realm, it required a lot of elemental power to stay in the air. If they fell into the water, it would not be fun. Brando turned his head and looked at the wall of water rising from the sea. Insursta, who was in his hand, could not help but remind him, "Damn it, be careful." After all, the latter did not want to be buried with Brando. But Brendel did not even move an inch. With a loud bang, the thousands of tons of seawater seemed to have crashed into an invisible wall and exploded, turning into rainwater that rained down from the sky. This is the power of the Supreme Realm? Insursta looked at this scene with his mouth wide open, and he could not close it. Brando frowned. This amount of seawater was nothing to him, but he did not catch a trace of the black shadow under the water. The shadow seemed to have disappeared without a trace in an instant. This was the first time something like this had happened in his field of law. He frowned and swept back and forth under the water with a few lines of law several times. After confirming that it was quiet again, he pondered in the air for a moment, then turned and flew in the direction of the port. Insursta could not help but let out a long sigh. In the name of the Dark Order, he complained, "Why am I always being carried like a bag of flour?" "I can put you down," Brando replied. The future star of Madara looked down at the dark sea and wisely shut his mouth. Brando looked at Fang Qi, who was beside him. "Why didn't you leave?" "I have a flying tool." "No, what I mean is, why did you stay? You told me to run away?" Fang Qi looked incredulous. Brando looked at this guy dumbfounded. Insursta was also a little speechless. He thought to himself that there really was a guy in this world who was more willful and arrogant than their king. But this genius of the Phantom Chariot had no self-awareness. His mind was still on the previous conversation. "So, Mr. Count, whether you agree or not, my patience is limited. If it's a duel, then forget it." "Then you agree to give Miss Delphian to me?" Brando rolled his eyes in annoyance. "I mean, I have no objections to teaching a little brat a lesson." "Haha," Fang Qi couldn't help but laugh. "Little brat, Mr. Count, how old are you?" He was halfway through his sentence when he suddenly stopped because Brando suddenly turned his head and looked at him. At that moment, Fang Qi had the illusion that he was being stared at by some terrifying behemoth. The space around his body tightened, and then the magic tools and abilities on his body lost their effect one by one. His whole body fell toward the sea like a weight. Ah! This guy suddenly screamed. But before he fell to the surface, Brando picked him up. After all, he still didn't know what was under the water. He couldn't let this guy hang in this place for no reason. However, while he could avoid the death penalty, he could not escape punishment. When Fang Chi was set up again, his originally dazzling black hair was now like a drowned rat draped over his shoulders. Water droplets were everywhere, drenching his luxurious robe into a mess. When Insursta saw this guy's appearance, he couldn't help but laugh out loud. He was a little relieved that he was smart enough not to go against Brando. Otherwise he might not end up well. Fang Chi looked at Brando with a murderous gaze. If looks could kill, Brando would probably die dozens of times before he stopped. What, you want to try again? Fang Chi didn't say a word. Apparently he had learned his lesson. Brando nodded with satisfaction. He didn't need this guy's cooperation. He just needed to let him know that he was afraid. The three of them quickly crossed half of the bay and came to the sky above the port. Huang Hua, Mr. Lu, Adni, and her knight had already landed here. When Brando and the other two descended from the air, they immediately surrounded them. What do we do next, emissary? Boss? Lady Adni almost spilled the beans because of a slip of the tongue. She scratched her ears and cheeks as she corrected herself. Her face was so red that it seemed like it was burning. Not far away, Quill shook his head helplessly. The knight lowered their heads, afraid that they would laugh out loud. Brando looked at Insursta. Previously they had made a lot of noise in the port. Even if someone was sleeping like a dead pig, someone should have woken up by now. But at this moment, the port was still quiet. This was definitely not normal. But Insursta frowned and shook his head. It's still the same. There's still the breath of life. Is it both? Both. Insursta nodded. In these ships, in the houses nearby? Brando looked around. The whole port of Gassel was like a dead city, but Insursta told them that this city was no different from normal. The situation at hand was really strange. Was even creepy. Even the female knight showed a look of displeasure when she heard it. She could not help but look around, afraid that a ghost would suddenly appear. She did not think that there would be a ghost in front of her, not to mention that there were two ships of skeletons with them. Insursta nodded silently again. Where's the nearest one? Brando asked again. Insursta raised his head and pointed at a warehouse not far behind Brando with his chin, indicating that there was the breath of life in that building. Brando glanced in that direction. It was a medium-sized warehouse about 100 feet wide and 20 to 30 feet tall. It was immersed in the darkness of the night. The style was very similar to the architectural style he had seen in Rosalind. From the outside, this warehouse was really ordinary, but it was really close to them. The closed door was almost in front of them. There was no movement behind the door. It did not look like there was anyone guarding it. He stretched out his hand in that direction and gently pushed. The door bolt automatically fell to the ground. He then pushed again and the door opened, revealing the dark space behind it. There's no one. Huang Hua spoke first. Brando also came to the same answer at the same time. He had Sky's eye and dark perception, so he knew the situation inside better than Huang Hua. There was not even a trace of goods in this warehouse, let alone people. It was empty inside. There was no hiding place at all. The others could not help but look at Insursta suspiciously. Chapter 1272. How is that possible? Insursta's expression changed. There must be someone inside. He's right there. As he spoke, he walked towards the warehouse as if he wanted to point out the direction to the others. But Brando stepped forward and grabbed his shoulder. Don't go. What's wrong? Insursta was stunned. At this time, Huang Hua suddenly cried out in a low voice. She opened her mouth slightly and looked at the scene in front of her in shock. Just as Brando stopped Insursta, the warehouse in front of them suddenly changed. A few translucent figures that seemed to be made of fog suddenly appeared in that place. They were two guards and a human dressed as a warehouse manager. They seemed to be unaware of the existence of Brando and the others. One of the two guards leaned against the wall and was talking to the warehouse manager, while the other sat on a stool and lit his pipe. And from the beginning to the end, these people did not even look in this direction. Suddenly they heard a burst of noise. They turned around stiffly and saw that the port seemed to have become busy in an instant. In the harbor shrouded in mist, ghostly workers and sailors were moving up and down the docked ships by the pier, moving goods. Others were operating the wooden tower cranes and cranes. A group of guards was on duty not far away. They were wearing overcoats and yawning as they stood under a street lamp that was not lit at all, supervising the work of these workers. The port of Gussell seemed to have come alive in an instant, as if the eerie silence of a moment ago did not exist. Everyone was stunned. What's going on? Adney was frightened. She held Quill's hand tightly and asked with a trembling voice, "Are these ghosts? The legendary ghost city?" But Incersta subconsciously wiped his forehead, although he did not sweat at all since he turned into an undead. He replied with a dry voice, "They are not ghosts. These things are not even ghosts. Martha above, I don't know what these things are. I can clearly feel the breath of life from these people, but, these people are clearly in front of us, but we can't feel their existence at all. It's as if they are not in the same world as us." Quill finished his words and completed his sentence. Yes, that's right," Adney said immediately. "Did you notice?" Huang Hua suddenly whispered. She was surprisingly calm at this time, although her face was also a little pale. "They can't see us either. What are they doing?" "Look over there," Huang Hua suddenly pointed in the direction of Gussell City and said. Everyone turned their heads and saw that on the main street connected to the port, carriages were parked. Hundreds of ghost residents were coming from that direction. Several long lines were connected head to tail, as if they were shrouded in fog. The fog moved forward slowly. Everyone in the line lowered their heads and staggered forward without saying a word. There were also a few knights around the team. They were different from ordinary people. They were riding on warhorses with grayish-white flames burning on their hooves. They held long spears that seemed to be woven from fog, and they were parallel to the long line. But everyone, whether it was the knight or the residents moving forward in the fog, had a heart-palpitating emptiness on their faces. There was no spirit in their gray eyes, as if they were simply moving forward for the sake of moving forward. After these people arrived at the port, under the supervision of the knight, they separated into several groups and began to board the ships in the port. Brando and the others watched these people walk up the gangplank one by one, their translucent bodies disappearing from the deck. They could not help but feel a chill down their spines. "They're boarding the ships?" Adney asked in disbelief. "No, they seem to be migrating. This should be all the residents of Gussell City, right?" Huang Hua frowned and said, "Mr. Incersta, what kind of city is Gussell City?" "As far as I know, it's just an ordinary human town." Incersta replied in a tone that even he was not sure of. "Are you sure it's ordinary?" "Madame Adney, I mean as far as I know. We can't stay here any longer," Brendel suddenly interrupted their conversation. His eyebrows were almost knitted together, and he said somewhat hurriedly, "Let's go, we have to leave this port immediately." "What's wrong?" "There's no time for nonsense." Brando grabbed Incersta's shoulder. "Don't touch the fog, don't look at those things, forget them. If you hear someone call your name, don't answer." "What? If you don't want to become one of them?" Brando glanced at the vice-captain and said to the others in a somewhat dangerous tone. Adney shuddered. "I know," Incersta finally reacted. "This is the unnamed?" The elven ranger Nukwal also spoke at the same time. "How can there be an unnamed here? This is not outside of order." Brando did not answer. He pursed his lips tightly. The unnamed may not be so terrible, but it was definitely not normal for them to appear in this place. Especially when he thought of the fog on the sea that divided the Torres Strait, he could not help but feel a storm in his heart. If it was as he expected, then there was only one possibility left. Everyone present also realized the seriousness of the problem, and followed Brando and flew out of the port. "Teacher." Phoenix Fire looked down and saw that several of the ships in the port were full of people. The whole ship was surrounded by fog. She lowered the sailboat, which was also woven from fog, and then slowly sailed forward. The scene almost made her cry out in fright. She clearly saw a ship made of fog coming out of the ship. It slowly sailed into the port, and with the surrounding fog, it spread out of the port. Teacher, Miss Delphian and the others still don't know what's happening in the port. It was only then that Brendel regained his senses. What Phoenix saw also fell into his eyes. He saw warships made of fog entering the harbor, and the Gussell port was suddenly filled with fog. It was as if a ghost fleet was lifting anchor and setting sail. The fog spread quickly, and if Delphian and the others did not lift anchor now, they might not be able to turn in time. "Incersta, signal Tarkus." He immediately said to Incersta, who was caught in his hand. The signal was a crystal that could emit a flash. They should have signaled the ship when they reached the shore, but because of this incident, it was delayed. However, the crystal could emit a yellow light, which was the most penetrating light in the fog. This crystal was prepared for them by Delphian in advance. Brando could not help but wonder if the Prime Minister's daughter had estimated something in advance. Incersta's true colors were undoubtedly revealed at this moment. After all, he was one of the future geniuses of Madara. After a brief moment of shock, he had now calmed down, opened his waist bag, took out the crystal inside, and sent a series of signals in the direction of the fleet. In fact, with Brando's own speed, he did not need to go through so much trouble. With his strength, he could return to the ship in the blink of an eye, but now he was not the only one here, and he could not leave one of them behind. Coupled with the need to guard against the ghostly thing under the bay, Brando instinctively felt that the thing was not like the Lost Names. The Lost Names rarely took the initiative to show aggression. As a result, the speed of the whole team slowed down a lot, and soon the fog rolled in from behind them. Strange. Seabass stared in the direction of the port of Guscell, and with some doubts, he saw that fog had started to appear on the waterway. A thin layer of fog seemed to have drifted over from the strait, but there was no wind at night. He straightened up from the side of the ship, and just as he was about to climb up the watchtower above the mast to see what was going on, Delphian patted him from behind. Seabass, go and pull up the anchor. She did not deliberately lower her voice, so everyone on the ship looked in this direction. What's going on? Nashin, who was measuring the depth of the water, pulled the rope out of the water and asked with some surprise. Miss Delphian, did you find anything? Brando looked up at the thin fog in the sky and asked. But of all the people, only Tarkus reacted the fastest. He frowned and pondered for a moment, then waved to his sailors and said, Listen to Miss Delphian. Raise the anchor, lower half the sail, and let the ship move. Delphian looked at the vampire nobleman with appreciation, then replied to the others, There must be a problem at the port. Regardless of what the Count and the others will do, we have to prepare in advance. She had not finished her words. A few flashes of light in the darkness came from the port. The Prime Minister's daughter's expression changed and she immediately ordered everyone, Quick, raise the sails and let the ship sail. Fergie the Unapproachable Dead Moon II Dark 22, Legendary Creature Human, Necromancer. When Fergie the Unapproachable enters the battlefield, if you do not use it from your hand, the summoner will immediately die and cannot be resurrected. Pay XMP, and the Dead Moon Twins put Fergie the Unapproachable, black derivative equivalent to the Dead Moon Twins level -15, into the battlefield. When Fergie the Unapproachable enters the battlefield, there will be X100 at least 1 counters. Whenever Fergie causes combat damage to a creature, the creature will be destroyed. It cannot be resurrected. Whenever Fergie causes combat damage to a planeswalker, the planeswalker will be killed. Whenever Fergie uses this ability to destroy a creature, the counter will be removed. When the counter reaches 0, she can no longer use this ability. Fergie the Unapproachable lasts until it is reset. Death is eternal life. Chapter 1273. In the blink of an eye, the bay near the port of Guscell was already shrouded in mist. Brando and the others were already very fast. While keeping an eye out for the thing under the water, they had already flown to the entrance of the bay in a few breaths. But what made it difficult for them was that the speed at which the mist was spreading was not inferior to the speed at which it was spreading. One by one, the mist sailboats were leaving the port at an unusually fast speed. The mist followed them closely and caught up with them in the blink of an eye. Suddenly, 2 cloud walls rose from the mist and formed the shape of sails. There were 4 layers on top and bottom, and they crashed forward majestically. Everyone quickly spread out from the left and right sides, but with just a slight delay, the mist surrounded them from all sides. Brando held the Incersta dragon in one hand and stretched out his other hand to release 2 streams of air, tearing a hole in the mist on the left and right. Seeing this, the others quickly followed suit. Although most of them were not necessarily elementalists or wizards like Brando, their magic equipment, swordsmanship, or special abilities might have a similar effect. Quill was held in the middle by 2 knight. He took out his longbow and shot a few explosive arrows in front of him. The air generated by the explosions blew away most of the mist. The effect was even better than Brando's spell. Adney held her sword with both hands and slashed forward. A white blade of light that was dozens of feet long flew out and tore a hole in the mist. The knights also activated the magic rings or necklaces on their hands. Fireballs, wind blades, and icicles appeared out of thin air. It was very lively. However, the one who stood out the most among them was Phoenix Fire. The little girl carried the will of the Jade Phoenix. She seemed to be holding a burning flame in her hand. Once she attacked, a sea of fire spread out and burned the fog in front of her. On the contrary, Fang Qi and Mr. Liu, who were stronger, did not make any contributions. The swordsman of the 9 Phoenix rarely relied on the power of external objects. Except for some special jade pendants and jade talismans, they rarely carried magic equipment. At this time, the two swordsmanship was obviously useless. Just like that, with the phoenix's fire leading the way, everyone forcibly opened up a path through the fog. Although the path was visibly becoming smaller and narrower, it was enough for everyone present. They quickly flew forward along the passage. On both sides there were ships traveling in the fog. These ships had almost merged with the fog. The parts of the ships that were in contact with the water seemed to be non-existent, leaving only the fog rolling on the surface of the sea. It was as if these translucent ghost ships were moving forward. It was extremely strange. Even Brando did not dare to approach these ships. The lost names were too mysterious. Few travelers who encountered the lost names in the wild were spared. In the Black Forest outside the world of order, many people disappeared silently from the world because of them. He didn't want to experience what happened in the deadly frost forest again. Although he had some experience, he didn't dare to say that he had 100% confidence in dealing with these things, let alone on the surface of the sea. Damn it, look ahead. Incersta suddenly shouted from below. Brando raised his head and looked in the direction he was pointing. He suddenly frowned. The dense forest on the hillsides on both sides of Gussel Bay was covered in fog at some point. The fog rose dozens of feet above the forest and spread rapidly toward the lower bay. In the blink of an eye, it was about to block the entrance to the bay in front. Everyone's face was a little pale. They could clearly see that the fog that was spreading to the sea would block the way out first. Speed up. Brando no longer cared about the strange thing under the water and said to the others. Everyone's speed suddenly increased, but Brendel was one step behind. With one hand on Oderfice's hilt, he inadvertently glanced down, just in time to clearly see a black shadow sweeping across the surface of the water. Without saying a word, he directly slashed down with his sword. A golden red line flashed in the darkness and smashed down into the sea. The surface of the sea instantly boiled and exploded. The black shadow suddenly jumped up from the sea and pounced in Brando's direction. The water splashed all over the sky, like rain falling down one after another. In the curtain of rain, Brando could clearly see that the thing didn't have a body, but the surrounding fog naturally outlined its outline. The fog spread out its wings and its shape was a little like a huge manta ray, but no manta ray could fly in the sky. When Brando saw this thing, he naturally thought of Ekis' nightmare he saw in the loop of trade winds. He didn't even think about it and punched forward. The space in front of his fist cracked inch by inch, shattering into a circle of ripples that could be seen with the naked eye. This ripple spread forward and affected the monster like a sound wave. Wherever it passed, the monster would also break inch by inch, and in the blink of an eye, it had been smashed into pieces. At this time, Brando turned around and the lines of law expanded to several kilometers in an instant. The silver line flashed across the sky and swept across the entire Gussel port like a sharp blade. Everyone who saw this scene was shocked, including Adney and Quill. Although they had seen Brando in action when he was in Rosaline, the strength that Brando had displayed at that time could only be said to be alarming, and not as terrifying as what was happening now. When the knights saw this scene, they almost stopped in their tracks. It was a sense of despair that came from the gap between their strengths. In the blink of an eye, a glimmer of hope appeared in these people's hearts, because at this time, someone with such strength was their ally. Huang He clenched her fists in excitement, her eyes shining. Fang Qi covered his mouth as if he had realized something. For a moment he looked a little absent-minded. Mr. Liu was disappointed. He glanced at Huang He, then at Brando and then at Fang Qi. He couldn't help but sigh. However, Brando raised his sword toward the forest on the west coast of Gussel. The tip of the sword lit up slightly, and a golden line flashed across the night sky, piercing straight toward the gentle ridge line there. Few people knew that this sword was the real flash strike sword art. The complete version of the flash strike sword art did not require the user to move at all. The attack could be done at will. Wherever the user's eyes and thoughts reached, everything would be under the sword's edge. Like the brightest light of thought in the darkness, it flashed and disappeared. Unfortunately, no one present even understood it. They thought that Brando had used some kind of magical ability, not a swordsmanship. The bright light left a long visual residue in everyone's vision in the darkness, but they felt that this attack did not have the effect they had imagined. After a flash of the golden line, it disappeared without a trace in the forest over there. They looked at Brando, but Brando did not look over there. He turned around and flew in their direction. No one present was an idiot. They already knew that someone was lying in ambush in the direction of the forest, and the underwater thing must have been made by the other party. But as for whether the other party had anything to do with the current lost name, it was hard to say. Teacher. Huang Ho was a little excited and leaned forward to say something. But Brando shook his head at her, motioning her not to speak. At this time, the fog in front of the bay had begun to close. If they did not hurry, it would be too late. In fact, it was already too late. The fog spread to the sea from the east and west, and had begun to seal the entrance. Behind them, the huge fleet in the fog was coming head-on. "Teacher, you go first. Don't worry about us," Huang Ho finally could not help but say. In the Nine Phoenix, people respected their teachers as if they were their parents. She naturally knew that her teacher had stayed behind to wait for them. If he was alone with his strength, he would have returned to the ship long ago. In any case, she did not want to be the one who dragged her teacher down. Behind her, Mr. Liu seemed to want to say something but hesitated. He knew that the future of the Jade Phoenix bloodline could not be lost in this place, but he could not bring himself to ask Brendel to disregard his own safety to help. Fang Qi, on the other hand, seemed a little calm. He only looked back with a slightly troubled expression. Clearly he had another way out. Brando noticed this detail, then shook his head at Huang Hua and said, "Follow me closely. Things have not reached that point yet. I'm not so weak that I can't even protect my own students." Teacher? Adni and her knights had long since fallen into chaos. Although this vice commander was somewhat muddle-headed, she wasn't someone who could remain calm in the face of death. Amongst the group, it was Quill who was much calmer. "We're dead. What should we do, Quill?" she said loudly, a little panicked. "Captain, it's not that bad yet. Mr. Brando hasn't abandoned us yet," Quill replied. "But we've only met him face to face. Do you trust him that much?" "I trust in Lord Ra's guidance." Martha above, these words sound a little like those old guys in the Holy Cathedral. Hearing this, Quill shook her head. But just as everyone's face was solemn, someone suddenly stared in the direction of the bay and exclaimed, "Ships!" Everyone followed the sound and looked ahead, only to see the outline of several warships faintly appearing in the fog. At first, they thought it was another fleet of the Lost Names, and their hearts fell into an abyss, thinking that there were pursuers behind and interceptions in front. This time they were doomed. But upon closer inspection, they found that the ships were somewhat familiar. Was it not the ship of the ghost chariot that was captured by the undead of Madara? "Oh my God, it's one of us." Chapter 1274. It was as if a kind of joy had arisen spontaneously from a desperate situation. Everyone was overjoyed and hurriedly flew in that direction. But Brendel was not too surprised. In fact, he had seen the ship a long time ago. It seemed that leaving Tarkus and Delphine on the ship was the right choice. The two of them did not make any mistakes at this critical juncture. Although the fog wasn't as dangerous as he had imagined, if he really had to break through the fog, the number of people around him would probably be reduced by a lot. At most, he could only protect Insursta and Phoenix Flame. Phoenix Flame, come here. The fog that came from the harbor had occupied more than half of the harbor. Phoenix Flame was the weakest among all of them. He did not dare to waste any time and extended his hand to her. Phoenix Flame was not shy at all. She quickly grabbed Brando's hand. Obviously, she knew that this was not the time to be particular about etiquette. She could not let everyone wait for her. In a few breaths, everyone landed on the ship one by one. As soon as Brando boarded the ship, he saw Delphian at the side of the ship looking in his direction. When the Prime Minister's daughter saw him, her eyes lit up and she quickly walked over. "Why are you on this ship? Where's Tarkus?" Brando put down Phoenix Flame and Insursta's dragon. Although he had expected this, he could not help but ask. The Prime Minister's daughter quickly sorted out her emotions and replied quickly, "He's on another ship. I insisted on coming. The other two ships are outside on the waterway between Tayweed Island and Gussel. They're waiting for us to join them. If necessary, we can abandon this ship." Brando nodded in satisfaction. He felt that keeping this woman by his side might not be a complete mistake. At least at this time she could be said to be the only person he could use. If he left Tarkus alone, he would not be completely at ease. "You've done well. The others have to thank you. But you don't have to come to this ship personally. I will do my best. If I can't see you safe with my own eyes, I won't be at ease. I have to watch the Nidvins revive." Brando scrutinized the woman's light purple eyes. The Prime Minister's daughter walked up to him and adjusted his collar. "What should we do next?" she asked. "Guzzle is done for," Brando replied. "We have to leave this place immediately." "What's going on?" "It's unnamed," Brando said as he walked in the direction of the gangway. "This fog?" He nodded. Delphian's expression changed, and only then did she show some lingering fear. Unlike the people of Jiufeng, the legend of the lost name was widely spread in Wonde. Unlike those shallow aristocratic socialites, she who was knowledgeable, certainly understood the heavy meaning of the word. Then she realized something and her expression changed again. She bit her lower lip and followed Brando's footsteps. She lowered her voice and asked, "The fog on the Tawu Strait?" Brendel nodded silently. He knew that he couldn't hide anything from this woman. Her mind was too sharp. "I hope I'm wrong. Otherwise the swift plains would be finished. At least the coastal areas would be finished. I don't know what happened to the green jade hillock, but—" He shook his head as he spoke and stopped at the gangway. Before they landed on the ship, Delphian had already ordered the ship to turn. Although they were temporarily safe, the situation was not as good as they had imagined. The ship made a turn in the bay, but the fog on both sides could not be stopped. But since they were on the ship and had their feet on the ground, they could free their hands to disperse the fog. Even so, the wall of fog on the surface of the sea was getting closer and closer. It was like a long and narrow strait, and it looked as if it would squeeze together at any time and crush them to smithereens. Needless to say, the fog coming out of Gussel was getting closer and closer. The fleets within the fog were almost right in front of them. Brando looked at the scene with a solemn expression. If necessary, he would have to give the order to abandon the ship. Fortunately, the speed of the ship was faster than expected. Soon he heard a cheer. Behind the closing fog there was a gap. Not far away was the Corsal waterway. Tarkus and his two ships were a few miles ahead, slowly moving towards the northern exit of Taywade Island. The moon had reappeared from the clouds, and the sea was frighteningly bright. At the very last moment before the wall of fog closed, the ship finally leaped out of the fog and entered the waterway between Taywade Island and Port Gussel. "Raise the sails quickly, quickly. You damned lazy bones, didn't the necromancer who summoned you teach you how to raise the sails?" Incersta's voice rang out from afar. The people on the deck heaved a sigh of relief. Some even ran over to Delphian to thank her. The Prime Minister's daughter always maintained a polite smile in front of these people. Brando looked in the direction of Port Gussel one last time, then turned around and pushed open the cabin door beside the gangway. He lowered his head and went in. Delphian hurriedly followed. The two went straight into the drawing room. The Prime Minister's daughter seemed to know what he was going to do. She took out a scroll of the sea map from the cabinet beside her and spread it out on the table. The sea map clearly marked the Tawu Strait, Swift Plains, Green Jade Hill, and the coast of the Sea of Eternal Darkness. The furthest point was Crete Island to the south of Saint Tassol and east of White Mountain. That place was less than 1,000 nautical miles away from Erewhon. It could be said that it was the easternmost and southernmost point of Wonde. Brando wasn't familiar with the geography of the East, but that didn't stop him from knowing where the Tawu Strait was on the Sea of Eternal Darkness. He saw the Prime Minister's daughter pressing her hands on the sea map, using a compass and a ruler to draw an arc. Delphian's black hair hung down on the sea map, but she didn't notice it. She frowned and bit her lips as she calculated carefully. Then she drew another line. That line was originally directed to the north of the Sea of Eternal Darkness, going up the Kherson Strait and into the Sea of Fallen Stars east of Saint Tassol. At the end of that line was the Great Glacier. Brando knew this line. On this line was the area where the lost names appeared most frequently. If the sea map continued to extend east, then the line would connect to Erewhon. It landed on the coastline north of the Deadly Frost Forest, crossed the entire Deadly Frost Forest, then entered Erech from the south of Lantan Island, passed through the great ruins under Feyre, and entered the territory of Princess Vladapes. There was a natural black forest on the southern border of this territory. Since the early days of the First Era, there were often sightings of the army of the lost names there. Then it continued to move east into the Sea of Glittering Light. From there to the north, there were many sightings in the Temple of the Earth and along the coast of Hazel. In theory, this line should have circled the entire Wonde. Many people once thought that the lost names were circling the entire Wonde, but no one knew what their purpose was. It was just obvious that the lost names only landed in the northern peninsulas of Erewhon, White Mountain, Hazel, and the forests of the southern border of the Ring of the World, a few areas of Ludwig north of Cruz, and the north of the 10 cities. Most of the time their route was actually at sea. But now this route had undergone a great change. Originally it was supposed to go north from the Kherson Strait, but now it had undergone a 180-degree reversal. Instead, it had turned south and plunged straight into the Kherson Strait. If he guessed correctly, after the line went south into the deep sea, it would turn east again and circle back to the Great Glacier from the north of 9 Phoenixes, continuing its cycle. But Brando and Delphian were both looking at the position of the Kherson Strait at the moment. "If I'm not wrong," The Prime Minister's daughter looked up after calculating the last line. At this moment, the moonlight just happened to pass through the porthole and shine on her face, making her look a little pale. Something should have changed in the Curson Strait, causing the marching route of the lost names to deviate. Now it's inserted south into the Curson Strait, and the entire Swift Plains should be covered by it. Brando shook his head. The Curson Strait has been cut off. What? The Prime Minister's daughter was stunned. He suddenly remembered something. It was the Bugis. The Slate War had begun, and it began with the floating city of Messenger falling into the Curson Strait. The disaster of White Mountain. There was no mention of the upheaval of 9 Phoenixes in history, but now that he thought about it, Madara did not eventually invade 9 Phoenixes at that time, perhaps because of this incident. It was just that the East had not yet been opened at that time, and the players had too little information. He frowned, and for a moment he did not remember if the connection between Erwin and 9 Phoenixes had been broken for a period of time at that time. Unfortunately, it was the last period of Erwin's life, and other than the bloody battle with Madara, there were no relevant details in his memory at all. Perhaps there was, but it wasn't the main information. Naturally, he couldn't remember all these minor details clearly. He was thinking, and Delphian naturally did not speak. But at this moment, the door creaked open, and Insursta came in from the outside. When he saw the two of them, he immediately said, "You're here." Brando and Delphian turned their heads at the same time. The future star of Madara gestured to them. "Count, I think you'd better come out and take a look." "What's wrong?" "I think we're in big trouble." Chapter 1275. When Brando returned to the top deck, the ship was sailing out of the waterway between Tewate Island and Port Gussel with full sails. The 2 ships of Tarkus in front had also slowed down, waiting for them to catch up. On one side of the sea was the rugged rocks of Tewate Island, which looked as white as phosphorus under the moonlight. The wind blew from the south of Gussel, causing the hull of the ship to sway slightly with the waves. Since Timmy's had passed through the clouds, the visibility on the sea was extremely high. He could clearly see the wall of fog moving slowly on the east side of the Tarish Strait. There seemed to be countless ships in the thick fog stretching out endlessly. The ships formed a wall between them, and the masts were faintly discernible. There were hundreds and thousands of ships in the wall. What made his face turn sour was that the fog was slowly approaching the west coast of the Torres Strait, which was where they were. It seemed that the fog was going to merge with the fog coming out of Port Gussel. This was not a big deal, but the problem was that their 3 ships were sandwiched in the middle. There was a dead silence on the deck. The people who were celebrating earlier were now speechless. They were still confident that they could pass through the thin fog in Port Gussel, but the wall of fog in front of them stretched for hundreds of miles, and they could not see the end of it on the wide sea. It was impossible to go around it. When Brando came out with Delphian and Insursta behind him, everyone subconsciously looked at him. Previously, he had led them out of the Bay of Gussel, and everyone subconsciously thought that Brando was the one who could solve the problem at hand. But Brando was actually unsure at the moment. He looked at the wall of clouds moving slowly on the surface of the sea with a solemn face, and he could not make up his mind. Tarkus had once sent a ship into the fog, and the ship returned the way it came, seemingly unaffected. But the state of the fog at that time was not the same as now. As for going around it, that was a joke. The fog had appeared since Rosaline, and they had been sailing north for 3 days without seeing its end. Who knew where the other end of the fog was? But the fog of Port Gussel was coming from the waterway behind them, and it seemed that the only thing they could do now was to continue sailing north. If there was no other way, they could only abandon the ship and go ashore. The fog could not go too far into the land. Although the ports along the coast had suffered, there were always safe places inland. It all depended on whether they could travel that far in a short period of time and leave the area covered by the fog. Brando turned his head and asked, "What's the terrain in the north? Is there a suitable place to go ashore? It would be best if it's a harbor that can shelter from the wind, and has mountains or hills nearby." Insursta thought for a moment, then replied, "Yes, there are, but there are places like this that have all become harbors, Count. Of the ports and other places. Of the ports and other places. And? However, due to the steep terrain of the western shore of the Tawu Strait, there were not many places to build a harbor. Therefore, the few places that were available were all used by humans or undead. It was really difficult to find a natural and undeveloped anchorage. "I know of such a place, teacher." At this time, Huanghua came over and looked at them. "What? But I've never been there. I've only heard of it. I heard that there's a pirate hideout in the Bay Canyon near Sopa Latch. I think if the pirates can use that place as their lair, We can also go ashore there. I've heard of that place too. Insursta seemed to be reminiscing, but there was not much joy on his pale face. But no one knows where the lair is. The fjords near Sopa Latch have a complicated terrain. If we find the wrong place, we'll be in trouble. Brando looked back at the dark sea between Tide Island and Gussell. The fog spread faster under the influence of the south wind, and the wall of fog on the Tide Strait was coming in their direction. They did not have many choices left. It's better than waiting for death, he replied. We have to try. How far is that place from here? Can we get there in time? It's not far. Delphine knew the question was directed at her. She had already memorized the map of Swift Plains. Sopa Latch is north of Gussell. It's only 100 nautical miles from here. It's one of the largest ports on the other side of the strait. But the history of this port is actually very short. It was only discovered during the year of the spider poison. But Sopa Latch has a wide belly and a narrow mouth. It's a natural shelter from the wind. The water in the port is more than 8 meters deep. It can accommodate almost all kinds of merchant and military ships in the Nine Phoenix region. It's an excellent natural port. It's said that it has the conditions to build a spaceport. 100 nautical miles was a distance that would take a normal person several days to cover on land. But it was not a long distance on the sea. The 3 ships were excellent armed merchant ships. The fastest could reach 12 knots with full sail, and the slowest could reach 10 knots. With the south wind blowing, they should be able to see the coastline of Sopa Latch by tomorrow morning. But that was only in theory. Only the heavens knew if the fog would actually give them that much time. Even though Brendel had some knowledge of sailing, he was not completely clueless. He could not calculate how fast the fog was moving on the surface of the sea, but at least he could tell that it was definitely not going to give them 10 hours of time. Half of that was good enough. Is the surrounding terrain very complicated? Sopa Latch is on the glacier belt. To the east is the southern edge of the Nine Phoenix Great Glacier. The movement of the glacier and the erosion of ice and snow easily created the complicated sea cliffs and fjords. In fact, the entire coastline of the western side of the Torres Strait is affected by similar geological changes. Only in the warmer area on the southeast side of the strait, the rivers after the melting of the glacier formed the alluvial plains. Brando understood. The Great Glacier of Wonde was located to the east of Fanzan and to the north of the Great Plains of Saint Tassol. But the term Great Glacier was actually a broad geographical concept. Its part in Wonde was only its westernmost edge. This glacier, or ice sheet, was a more appropriate name. It was the impasse to the west of Wonde. It was also the largest part of the Black Forest, outside the borders of Wonde. Of course, the Black Forest was far from just a forest. This glacier extended to the east and no one knew where its boundary was. It then went south across the Kherson Strait and intersected with part of the border of Madara. After that, it crossed the Torres Strait and became a huge part of the impasse on the northern border of the Nine Phoenix Great Glacier. And this part of the Nine Phoenix Great Glacier was the thing that the Prime Minister's daughter mentioned. Brando pondered for a moment and looked at Insursta. Go and signal Mr. Tarkus. We are heading north. Our destination is Sopa Latch. By the way, how many liches do you have on board? Must they be middle-ranked or above? He suddenly asked. Insursta was stunned for a moment and did not understand the meaning of this question. Not many, Count. Including the adjutant on this ship, there are no more than 5. So few. Brando was a little puzzled. He knew that in Madara, liches were the most important part of the army. It was not an exaggeration to say that they were the backbone of the army, especially in this era where their undead summoning magic had not been improved. There were no elite skeleton warriors at the basic level, no assassin undead, and no cheap necromancer apprentices. Liches were the most important mid-ranked and low-ranked commanders of the undead. Moreover, liches were Madara's most precious and rare technical troop class. Like the Navy before the appearance of the intelligent elite skeleton warriors, the general skeleton warriors were at most used as cannon fodder. That was to say, they were used in boarding battles or landing battles. If they were used as sailors, they could at most handle simple tasks such as cleaning the deck or rowing the ship. In fact, only liches with a certain level of intelligence could be qualified as professional sailors. How could there be only 5 professional sailors on such 2 large ships? Brando was a little puzzled. In Rosaline we usually use humans to supplement the sailors. The humans here often deal with us. If we can afford it, they won't mind working for us. After all, we are not a real warship. It is impossible for mid-ranked liches to be equipped with so many of them. Those things are also very precious to us. Insursta shook his head and smiled bitterly. Actually, there are still some in Rosaline, but we didn't think of bringing them out. What do you need them for? Brendel was a little speechless. Professional human sailors were actually stronger than necromancers. Middle-ranked necromancers had intelligence, but there was a limit to it. High-ranked necromancers were no different from humans or even better, but how many of them were there in Madara? Most of them had become undead lords. However, it was a pity that what he needed now was not professional sailors but liches. Although liches could be sailors, their real function was not only to be sailors, but also to be part of the mid-ranked and low-ranked officers in Madara. More importantly, they were all mages, although it might be a little lame. But that was enough. Seeing that Brando's expression was a little unpleasant, Insursta, who had learned to read people's expressions these days, quickly said, "But there are still many low-ranked liches, Earl." Brando shook his head. "No need. Let Tarkus gather the mid-ranked liches and send them here. I want to do something and I need a few mages to help." Chapter 1276. Insursta finally understood why Brando only wanted mid-level necromancers. Low-level necromancers that relied on bone staffs to cast spells obviously couldn't be called mages. They didn't have the ability to cast spells themselves. The vice-captain of Pole's Feathers, Lady Adney, had come over at some point. She heard their conversation and couldn't help but interrupt. "Actually, I know some magic too." Brando turned around in surprise. "Lady Adney, you know some magic. Do you have the level of a mage apprentice?" "A little higher than that, but really just a little." "That's enough." Brando waved his hand. He saw that Adney was about to speak again and interrupted her. "Double it." "What?" Adney's eyes almost popped out of their sockets. "The reward," Brando replied with the face of a tycoon. "I'll double the one we agreed on before. How about it?" Of course, no problem." "Wait, you're not lying to me, are you, Mr. Brando?" A crystal drew an arc in the air and fell into her hand. "This is the deposit," Brando said to her. Adney looked at the crystal and had the same reaction as Exen. She sucked in a breath of cold air. A flame-patterned crystal. This crystal alone was enough to cover half of their reward, and it was only a deposit. The vice-captain immediately saw the extent of Brando's wealth and couldn't help but blurt out, "By the name of Martha, my lord, do you still need retainers?" Brando froze for a moment, thinking that it would be great if these mercenaries could join him. A dozen or so elemental enlightenment experts would almost double his strength in Tanagel. "Of course," he replied at once, "I welcome a capable person like Miss Adney at any time." Adney's eyes were almost shining. "Good. When this is over, I'll definitely resign." "Count, you can't go back on your words." "Resign? Aren't you mercenaries?" Brando couldn't help but laugh when he saw the knight lowering their heads and covering their faces. Even though he knew that these guys weren't mercenaries, he couldn't help but feel amused. If this world was filled with mercenaries of this level, the world would have been in chaos long ago. She did not expect Brendel to question her on this point. She stuttered to the point that she could not even speak properly. "Count Brendel, the wind was too strong just now." "Did you hear wrongly?" Quill looked up at the sky and sighed. However, Brando didn't hold on to this matter. Since he already knew that these people's identities might not be that simple, he only needed to know if they had malicious intentions. But judging from the current situation, it didn't seem likely. At the very least, if assassins or spies were so incompetent, then there was probably no such thing as a successful assassination or leak of secrets in this world. Moreover, he still had other things to do. What he needed to do was to set up some simple wind magic circles. The speed of these ships clearly wasn't enough. Even if he added a few oars, it wouldn't help. After all, even if his oarsmen were heroes from the Argo that went to the sacred forest to retrieve the Golden Fleece, they wouldn't be able to double the speed of the ships. Moreover, these ships weren't sailing ships. If this was his original world, he might be helpless. But this was Wond, a world of magic. In fact, most sailing ships in this world were built with many magical materials, such as the lighter rudder that was enchanted with water magic and the wind sails that were enchanted with wind magic. This made them much faster than sailing ships in the real world. However, Brando knew that with the support of magic they could be even faster. However, first of all, this required a one-time magic storage item. Secondly, it also required the continuous support of a magician. Generally speaking, only floating battleships had this kind of treatment. He had never heard of sailing ships burning money like this. After all, most sailing ships in this world were merchant ships, and merchants always had to consider the cost. Brando didn't have a magician, but he knew that Madara had a lich. Even without the support of a bone staff, An intermediate lich was still at the level of an apprentice magician. As for the magic storage item, Brando planned to make it himself. Don't forget that he still had an alchemy level. Although he hadn't used it for a long time and it was almost rusty, and the ship didn't have an alchemy lab or any suitable materials, he didn't need these things. He had the blood sacrifice alchemy. Secondly, he had money. The second point was especially important. Brando planned to use magic crystals to make a magic storage array. He planned to use magic to directly release energy to simulate magic. This was the only way to simply and crudely bypass all the necessary materials. However, the price was naturally to burn money. Insursta had 5 mid-level liches under his command. If 2 of them were to maintain a magic circle, he would have to consider abandoning one of the ships. However, if that was the case, he would have to concentrate everyone on the remaining 2 ships, which would further slow down the ship's speed. Right now they were in a race against time. Every second the ship slowed down meant more danger. This was obviously not the result he wanted. Delphian was now a necromancer. Unfortunately, after she was sealed into a card by Brando, she wasn't summoned by the twin death moons. Therefore, her current power was not based on the Mephistopheles and Andrique. She was just a normal person like herself, so her ability was temporarily out of the question. Fortunately, Adeline also knew magic, so the problem was solved. However, if he were to make 3 magic arrays, Brando estimated that he would need to use at least half of the magic crystals he had on him. This number was shocking enough. After all, he had brought a lot of magic crystals from Tanajal. Later on, he replenished some from the fleet at Fathom Harbor. When he was in the elemental frontier, Miss Tata and the Termosian had also given him some. The latter part of the magic crystals was especially high quality. It could be said that half of the magic crystals he had on him was more than enough to build a frigate, let alone speed up the sailing ship. This was also the reason why merchants never used this method to speed up their sailing ships. Therefore, when Brando finished drawing the blood sacrifice array on the deck and then covered it with a layer of magic crystals, almost everyone on the ship was stunned. Most of them were people of status. Insursta was a noble in Madara, and the Knights of Ra's Wings were also of noble birth in Lubeck. Not to mention Huang Hua and Mr. Liu, although Fang Qi wasn't a noble in the Nine Phoenix, his birth was only higher than that. It wasn't that they hadn't seen alchemy before, but they had never seen such a rich alchemy. This wasn't alchemy at all. It was simply a joke with the magic crystals. Fang Qi stood at the side with his arms crossed. He was full of disdain for Brando's alchemy level. Apart from the somewhat strange blood sacrifice method, in his opinion, this country bumpkin from the west was indeed worthy of his identity as a country bumpkin. Few people knew that he, the genius of the Ghost Chariot clan, was also quite a genius in alchemy. Although he wasn't far superior to Tamar, he who had received systematic learning and education in alchemy, was at least not inferior to the alchemy masters that Brando knew. Not to mention the alchemy of the East and the West both had their advantages. At least at this moment, Brando's alchemy was basically not worth mentioning in his eyes. However, after a while he felt a little toothache. To be exact, he felt a little heartache for those magic crystals. It wasn't that the Ghost Chariot clan didn't have that much wealth, but that was the wealth of the entire organization. At least he didn't have that much money to squander. As for Miss Adney, she was tightly clinging to Quill's sleeve, almost unable to breathe. If it weren't for the Elven Ranger supporting her, she would have collapsed to the ground. Her eyes were filled with the radiance of magic crystals, sparkling brightly, and her mouth kept chanting as if she had been possessed. "Oh my God, Martha above Lord R, I'm not dreaming, am I? You also know alchemy?" Insursta looked at Brando with a little surprise, but he soon exclaimed in a fuss, "This is blood sacrifice alchemy. Isn't this taboo under the rule of the Holy Cathedral of Fire? Oh my God, how can you do this? Hurry up and put away those magic crystals. If you don't lack money, just give them to me." But Brando didn't care about his clamor here. As soon as the magic circle was formed, he directly flipped Odorfeist's blade and gently cut his thumb. But this time it didn't cut. Brendel almost scared himself out of his wits. He quickly increased his strength and cut a second time. There was a sharp pain, and this time he barely managed to cut a thin wound. Then he saw a drop of golden blood flowing out from it. Brando couldn't help but be stunned. He knew how sharp the holy sword Odorfeist was. In the whole, the amber sword, there was probably no sword with a higher attack power than these holy swords. He was very careful before, afraid that he would cut off his finger. That would be too funny, but he never dreamed that he would have to use electricity to cut a hole in his body with Odorfeist. And what's with the color of the blood? He dared to swear that when he was in the elemental barrier, his body didn't have such changes. This was either some kind of mutation when he passed through the spatial crack of the magic storm, or the powerful life force of the nature orb during the explosion of Rosaline's body brought about changes to his body. In his heart he was more inclined to the latter. And just as Brando was stunned, the others were also stunned, but they didn't notice the color of the blood flowing out of Brando's body. They were shocked by the sudden flames of all the magic crystals on the magic circle. Adeline even let out a sigh mixed with many complicated feelings. This sigh was so melancholic that it made people who heard it feel disheartened, as if they were about to jump into the sea and commit suicide. Chapter 1277. The Grey Cliffs stood tall in the fog. Such a scene was often seen in the fjords around the Sopa Latch. They were like silent giants standing by the sea, and the ships passing under their feet were frighteningly small. The wind was somewhat cold. It was not the cold of autumn in Abies, but the temperature was bone-chilling. Because this was the south of the Great Glacier, when people talked about the Great Glacier, their faces would always change. The wind howled at the top of the canyon, making a sound like a ruler scraping through a rag. Dark clouds covered the fjords, making people feel as if the sky would collapse at any time. Logically speaking, under such bad weather, the fog should have been blown away. But the wind poured into the fjords, and the fog from the outside continued to pour in. Instead, the fog in the straits churned as if it would never stop. The fleet set off from Gussel, and took 3 to 4 hours to reach the Sopa Latch. Because the fog came from the north, they had to take refuge in the fjords in advance. The terrain in the Sopa Latch fjords was complicated. After traveling for half an hour through the winding straits, they could no longer distinguish between front and back. As for the pirates' hiding place, it was even more remote. Brando was not in a hurry. He used the lines of law to scan the surrounding fjords, carefully searching for the clues he wanted. Soon he found an unusual place. After a quarter of an hour, the fleet appeared there. It was a bay canyon with its own world in its belly. The entrance was at a 90-degree angle, blocking the wind from the outside, making this wide body of water appear somewhat tranquil. There was some thin mist floating on the surface of the water like a veil. In the depths of the canyon there was a huge cave entrance. The cave entrance was connected to the surface of the sea, allowing ships to navigate. In addition, it was located in the depths of the fjords, very hidden, and very suitable for pirates to hide. If he did not spread out his extreme planes, ordinary people would not be able to find it. When the 3 ships slowly sailed into the inner canyon, passing through the mist, they saw the huge cave entrance hanging alone on the cliff. Everyone could not help but look at the Count of Erewhon with respect and admiration. The journey had been fraught with danger, but Brendel had led them out of Gussel's encirclement, and then he had taken out a legendary amount of wealth and generously burned it to the ground, allowing the fleet to sail on the wind and arrive at Sopa Lake before dawn. Then he decisively ordered the fleet to hide in the fjords in advance, and with his own strength, he broke through the heavy fog and came to this place. Seeing the pirates' hiding place in front of them, even if they were on the opposing side, Insursta and Tarkus could not help but cheer for each other. It's not like Madara can't accept a noble from another country. Count, if you're willing to bow down to His Majesty, Aween will remain the same. Insursta did not know how many times he had said this in Brando's ear. Brando stood at the bow of the ship, looked back at him with a slight smile and shook his head. Can you promise this? And I have no intention of becoming the King of Erewhon. I will have a good talk with your Majesty, but it's hard to say who will be in charge. Insursta sighed. When these two met, it would be hard to predict what would happen. But even if Madara had another outstanding dark noble, it would be good. Subconsciously, he no longer regarded Brando as someone on the same level as himself, but compared him to the existence with the Mercury staff. But he was still not optimistic about Brando's chances. He did not have the slightest doubt about the rise of the Kingdom of the Dead Moon, and in another time and space, it was indeed the same. The 3 ships slowly sailed into the cave, and the surrounding light suddenly dimmed. Adni's Knight's men lit torches, and under the flickering light, they found that the inside of the cave was extremely wide. A wide and deep waterway went straight into the depths of the darkness, surrounded by smooth limestone walls. The cave was 30 to 50 feet high, and countless stalactites hung overhead. Brando and Tarkus originally planned to sail in at the risk of running the ship aground, but they did not expect the waterway to be so good. It had a very deep draft and looked like a natural harbor. Although the throughput may be a little small, it was extremely rare as an anchorage. God knows how the pirates found this place. The light of the torches slowly moved forward with the ship, illuminating the surrounding dark cave walls. The limestone walls of the cave were mixed with some kind of metal, which refracted a yellow light. But the deep waterway had an end. Soon they saw a small bay that could anchor 1 or 2 ships. At the other end of the bay, there seemed to be a simple dock. A crooked wooden trestle was built into the deep water and connected to the shore. At this moment there were no ships in the dock and no pirates. This made the knight, who had been ready to fight with weapons in hand, suddenly feel relieved. But they were a little unwilling. They had been chased all the way from Gussel like a stray dog, and the enemy was nowhere to be seen. To these masters of their respective fields who had the dignity of being masters, this was obviously very frustrating. Masters of elemental enlightenment were considered masters in every aspect, and to have such a group of people gathered together as mercenaries was probably something only Lady Adney could think of. Compared to that, they would rather fight to their heart's content, even if they lost. In the end, they did not even touch the pirates. The pirates did not anchor their ships in the port, which meant that they did not stay here. This was not surprising. After all, this was just a hideout, not their nest. Just like the temporary anchorages often used by smugglers, they would occasionally stay in those places when storms came, but they would not stay there permanently. Everyone felt lost, but in fact it was just a psychological effect. After all, if they could avoid fighting, no one would be willing to do it except for fanatical warmongers. The 2 ships entered the port one after the other. The Ghost Chariot clan ship had been left outside, because no matter how big the cave was, it could not accommodate such a large armed merchant ship. A layer of mist hung in the cave just like the inner gorge outside, but it was much better than outside the fjord. The fleet in the mist had almost covered the entire Tawu Strait. Brando had never seen so many lost names in this life and his previous life, let alone others. After the ship was parked, everyone disembarked one by one. Then Tarkus ordered the skeleton soldiers on the ship to drill through the ship and let them sink here to prevent them from being used by outsiders. The first batch of skeleton soldiers who landed by boat had already explored the passage at the other end of the cave, so these ships were naturally not needed. Tarkus and Brando did not expect to wait until the mist outside dissipated before continuing to sail out to sea, not to mention that it was not necessarily safe dozens of miles offshore. They had to reach the real inland area to completely avoid the march of the lost names. This was also the reason why they did not directly force their way ashore from other places. After landing, they had to open up a path along the wilderness. Who knew when they would run into the marching route of the lost names? Since this was the pirates' landing point, there must be a safe land route behind it. Otherwise, this place would at most be a safe haven, not a temporary lair. As for whether sinking the ship would cause any trouble for the people behind it, Brando had never considered this issue. Why should he be so considerate for the pirates? As for Tarkus, he was even more disdainful to consider this. Even if the undead might reactivate this port in the future, they would have the means to salvage the sunken ship. As for the pirates? Who cared about this? After everyone got off the ship, the cave seemed a little cramped. After all, in addition to Brando, Delphian, and Phoenix Hua, there were 2 squadrons of skeleton soldiers and a group of low-level liches on the 2 armed smuggling ships from Madara. They were usually locked in the bottom cabin as ballast in Madara style. They would only be released when there was a battle or when they needed to land. In addition to the skeleton soldiers, there were also the sailors on the Ghost Chariot's armed merchant ship. There were also more than 10 people. Including the 2 elders and their servants as well as Fang Chi's subordinates and servants, there were about 20 to 30 people. Adney and her knight men were another group. For a time, there were more than 100 people in the pirates' hiding place. It was obviously impossible for this small place to not look cramped. Tarkus divided 1.5 squadrons of skeleton soldiers, the other half was left in Gussel, into 2 groups. One group continued to act as cannon fodder in front, and 3 liches were in charge of commanding them. The other group, which was larger in number, was at the back. It was not to guard against anything but mainly to serve as a warning. If they encountered the lost names later, at least they could detect them in advance. They were still cannon fodder in essence. The sailors of the Phantom Chariot were naturally captives at this time, but no one cared about the ordinary sailors. The servants of the 2 elders of the Phantom Chariot were quite strong, so they were watched over by Adney's knight. Of course, Brando also paid for this. The female knight was very satisfied with Brando's generous employer. Only the 2 elders of the Phantom Chariot were a little troublesome for Brando and Tarkus. After all, they were Supreme Class Masters, although only half a step into the Supreme Class. Even if Deputy Marshal Brando was monitoring them, there would be problems if he was not careful. The 2 had obviously suffered a lot these days. They had been locked in the bottom cabin with the skeletons and liches, and the food they ate was worse than pig and dog meat. It was not that Tarkus deliberately slighted them, but that was all the sailors could eat at sea. The undead could not specially prepare a cook for the two captives. That was the treatment that only Brando and Delphian had. Chapter 1278. Because Fang Chi had always been in the hands of Tarkus and Insursta, they naturally did not dare to act rashly and endured. When Brando saw the two of them again, he almost could not recognize them. The two of them seemed to have aged 10 years in a few days. Even their wrinkles had increased a lot, and they looked like they had reached the age of old. When the two of them saw Brando, they showed a look of horror at the same time. Obviously, the battle at Rosaline Port had left an indelible shadow in their hearts, especially the last confrontation between Brando and the Holy Jade Sword. That was almost beyond the imagination of mortals. Looking at the two of them, Brando knew that these two guys could not stir up any waves. At least in front of him, they did not dare to act rashly. He motioned to Tarkus to ignore the two of them and just keep an eye on Fang Chi. As for the latter, since coming out of Gussel Port, his originally arrogant nature had been restrained a lot. He did not dare to provoke him again. Brando saw a few times that the latter looked like he wanted to say something to him, but in the end he held back. He did not mind communicating with the other party, but when he thought of Delphian's instructions, he smiled and suppressed his thoughts. He thought that with this guy's funny temper, it would be good to keep him under control. In this way, Brando and Huang Hua, together with the unfathomable daughter of the Prime Minister, the smuggler Na Xian and his son, and the undead of Madara, who were obviously not on the same side as them. In addition, there were the common captives of both sides, the successor of the Ghost Chariot clan and their genius of this generation, their two great elders and many sailors and servants. Finally, there was the female knight and her party, who also obviously had other thoughts. Such a group of people with different thoughts gathered together at this moment. The skeletons in front of them had already explored the way. In the depths of the cave was a relatively narrow cave, but it was still dry. The terrain gradually went up as if it was connected to somewhere else. The knight followed behind, holding rosin torches. The flames were bright and dark, gradually outlining the outline of the cave. This was obviously a cave eroded by water. It might have originally flowed through an underground river. The underground river eroded the limestone here thousands of times, forming a complex cave system. In some places, it almost spiraled upward. The smooth stone surface or protruded from the surrounding stone walls, forming a cluster of beautiful stalactites. Such a scene was amazing at first, but after a long time, it was inevitable that it would be boring. Brando initially thought that they would be able to walk out of the cave in a quarter of an hour, but he did not expect to walk for a few hours. The cave was narrow at first, and they had to line up in a long line along the narrow path. But later it gradually became wider. The walls of the cave expanded in all directions, almost forming an open underground space. Moreover, it formed a precipice on one side. Looking from that direction, it was pitch black. Below the precipice was almost an abyss, and the light of the torch could not illuminate the end at all. Tarkus threw a stone down, and after a while, he heard the echoes of the stone. Brando extended his line of law downward and found that there was an underground lake below, at least 200 or 300 feet above the surface. As he continued to move forward, he heard the sound of water coming from the darkness. Although he couldn't see the direction, he could tell that it was a waterfall. It seemed that the original underground water had changed its course here and poured into the underground lake. But this underground space was frighteningly large. The pirates who originally stayed here would not have not discovered it. This was simply a natural hiding place. He now began to doubt his previous judgment. The previous port was a little too clean. With such a large hiding place, the pirates could not have completely ignored it. But where did they go? Brando did not know that while he was thinking about this problem, a few hundred meters away on the other side of the cliff in the darkness, between two stalactites, there was a pair of eyes looking over here. The dark eyes reflected the distant light of the fire. The owner of the eyes did not necessarily see Brando and the others clearly, but the light of such a bright torch was enough to spread far in the darkness. He stayed in place for a moment, then put a handful of beans in his mouth, chewed a few times and turned to leave. The man nimbly slid down a stone slope, as if the darkness was nothing to him. He circled around the stalactites a few times, found one of the caves and quickly went in. He did not go far before a faint light came from the front. Seeing the light, the man narrowed his eyes and quickened his pace. He walked to the corner and saw the scene in the cave where the light came from. It was a small stronghold. There were a few beds in the cave, and there were even more hammocks hanging in the air. A few cabinets filled every inch of the walls in the cave, and there were a few boxes scattered between the cabinets and the beds. Inside the cave, a few candles were lit, and there were more than a dozen people sitting on the beds. When the man barged in, the others looked back warily in his direction. The man ignored them and shouted, "Big sister? Lady White Mist, an outsider has barged in." Everyone turned their heads and looked into the depths of the cave. There was a cloth curtain there, and beside the stove outside the cloth curtain, there was a furry white cat curled up in a coiled position. When the cat heard the voice, it looked up and narrowed its eyes at the man. "Oh, another fat sheep has come in?" White Mist licked her whiskers and narrowed her eyes. "Where did they come from? Are they from Sopalach? Or are they other pirates? Or are they hiding from those who have lost their names?" "I don't know," the man replied. "But their team is a little strange." "How so?" "I see Madara skeletons and there seems to be people from Nine Phoenix and some foreigners." "Why would Madara skeletons be with people from Nine Phoenix?" "I think it's the tyrant of the Ghost Chariot clan from Swift Plains, big sister." The pirates immediately started to clamor. "Shut up," White Mist snapped. If not for the fact that she needed these people to help her gather information about Soparake and Elm Harbor, she would have thrown them into the sea to feed the fishes. Furthermore, she would not kill a single one of them wrongly. But if not for the fact that she had to take care of Hippamera, who was injured and unable to move, she would not have needed these people. She would have gone to Sopalach or Elm Harbor to gather information about Brando. But at least they were still useful for now. As an ancient witch spirit, White Mist did not have much sympathy for humans. These days she let these pirates go out to sea to help her plunder necessary supplies, food and water, mainly for Magadal and Hippamera, and she did not feel guilty at all. It was also for this reason that she instructed these people to avoid the lost names outside. Although she did not know what happened to Wand, as a witch spirit with thousands of years of experience, it was easy for her to recognize those damn things. It was for this reason, and the severe punishment she had given to these unruly gentlemen, that she had at this moment established a rudimentary authority in the community. A pirate group with a cat as their captain, it would be a joke if word got out. However, these gentlemen, the gentlemen of the sea, did not dare to laugh. In fact, when White Mist coldly spat out the two words "shut up," these two words produced the appropriate deterrent force they should have. Sure enough, the cavern became absolutely silent. Compared to a witch who had mastered ancient dark knowledge, the pirates' childish tricks were nothing. The witches weren't joking when they said they could pull out someone's tendons and skin them. That unlucky pirate was still hanging outside after being dried by the wind. Go and find out who it is. Don't kick an iron plate, I'm too lazy to come out and save you. The pirates nodded repeatedly. But at this time, the curtain behind her was suddenly gently lifted by a hand, and the silver elf Princess Medisha came out from inside, holding the wall. Her face was a little pale, but she spoke very firmly. "White Mist, I can feel the Lord." "What did you say?" "My lord, he is very close to us. My Planeswalker authority has detected him, and my lord must have detected me too." "Really?" Brando did indeed feel the presence of Medisha at this moment. To be precise, he felt the existence of his secondary authority, and then he realized that it was the Silver Elf Princess, and then he felt the presence of Hippamera. The shock was no small matter. He stopped almost immediately, almost causing Delphine, who was behind him, to bump into him. The Prime Minister's daughter was stunned. She raised her head to look at him and asked in a low voice, "What's the matter?" "What's wrong?" "I can feel Medisha," Brando replied. "My lord?" Medisha's soft voice was immediately transmitted through their telepathic connection. "Is it really you?" Her voice was full of surprise. "Medisha." Brando was very excited, and he was worried about his subordinates who were left in Rushta. So many things happened after the moonfall, and no one knew what happened to them in the end. "Are you okay? Where are Charles and the others? Why are you here? Weren't you teleported away?" He fired off a barrage of questions in rapid succession. Medisha paused for a moment. She was about to answer. But suddenly, her voice became cold as if she had turned into the little princess in Chablis. "It's you, Lady Delphian." Brando felt a cold wind blow on his back. Chapter 1279. I thank you from the bottom of my heart, my lord. Thank you for everything you've done for us. The same goes for your kindness, Brando replied. He naturally had a good impression of the kind-hearted princess. This nun princess didn't do anything spectacular in history, but everything she did was supported by kindness and justice. History didn't need too many revolutionaries, What it needed were thousands of people like the nun princess. He suddenly remembered something and said to Magadol, "I brought someone with me. You might want to meet him, your highness." Who is it, my lord?" Magadol was stunned. Brando saved her life during the battle in Ampere Seal, so their relationship was closer than his relationship with Princess Griffine. Therefore she did not feel awkward when talking to him. "It's Mr. Blanc, your grandfather." "What?" Magadol was shocked. Duke Blanc went missing in a shipwreck not long after the Holy War. At least that was what the Antiburo family claimed. It had been at least 60 years since then. Although she was not born when her grandfather went missing, she had at least heard about it. Because the Archduke's death was announced as a missing person, it wasn't that she hadn't thought that he might appear in places like Nine Phoenix, but so many years had passed. Even if he was lost at sea, if he hadn't died, he should have returned long ago. Although the connection between Nine Phoenix and Vaunt was blocked, it wasn't completely unrelated. She knew that her grandfather was a sword saint and would not be hindered by a little distance. Therefore she only thought about it occasionally and treated it as a fantasy. She did not expect that it would one day become a reality. However, she had never seen her grandfather since she was born. She only knew that her grandfather was the most legendary hero of the Antiburo Principality. She admired her grandfather very much, but she didn't know what to do when she had to face him all of a sudden. "My grandfather? Where is he?" "He's outside. I haven't told him that you're here, so I wanted to ask for your opinion." I will see him at once." "Excuse me, Monsieur le Comte." Princess Magadol apologized to him and was about to rush out. However, she paused for a moment and went back to tidy up her dress to see if there were any wrinkles or omissions. This behavior showed that the princess was at a loss for what to do. But it was understandable. After all, they were blood relatives. Although they hadn't met for decades, they still couldn't part with each other. Moreover, Brando knew very well what it would mean for this small duchy if the old duke returned to Antiburo. It was impossible for Magadol not to be nervous and concerned. Magadol hurried out of the room, leaving Brando and Medicia alone in the narrow stone room. Ipamera then thanked him softly. She was a very contented girl and did not think of how to repay him. After all, Brando was her lord and her master. That was enough for her. Medicia was silent for a moment before she asked, "I never thought that Princess Magadol's grandfather would be here. I heard that he went missing decades ago." "There's more to this than meets the eye. Actually, it's not like what the rumors say. But that's Marshal Blanche's private matter after all," Brando explained. "I understand," Medicia shook her head. "But my lord, do you think that Marshal Blanche knows about Miss Magadol's existence?" Brando was silent. He did not tell Blanche about Magadol in advance because of this reason. Perhaps Magadol herself did not know about the uniqueness of her body. The storm's core in her body was originally the power core of the giant god warrior. Any ordinary person would definitely not be able to carry such a thing in their body. There was no doubt that this princess was not human. Unless she was premeditated by someone, the Antiburo family's role in this was very suspicious. But from Magadol's reaction, the possibility of the former was very slim. And the current Duke of Antiburo would definitely know about his daughter's situation. What about the previous Duke? That was hard to say. Of course, he did not want to pry into other people's privacy. He just did not want to hurt this kind princess. Perhaps not interfering was the best way to protect her. But if the Antiburo family really had ill intentions towards Magadol, then he would have to intervene. Not only was Princess Magadol the best friend of Princess Griffine, she was also the best friend of all Tanajal. During the time she lived in Abes, she had formed deep friendships with almost everyone. Such an outstanding lady, Brando would never let her get hurt, and Medicia naturally would not. Brando was silent for a moment, then suddenly took out the angel's heart bottle and shook it in front of the silver elf princess. "I heard that you were injured too. Medicia, do you need this?" Medicia was extremely intelligent. She could see through Brendel's guilty conscience and couldn't help but laugh out loud. She covered her mouth with the back of her hand and said, "There's no need for that. This is a miraculous artifact. My lord, please don't use it as a tool to please girls." "I don't have such thoughts, I'm just worried about my subordinates." The silver elf princess snorted softly. "Actually, I have always suspected that the relationship between Miss Delphian and my lord is not that simple." "Ahem?" She raised her head and looked at him carefully. "Actually, I know what Miss Delphian is thinking. That's why I said that she was a little pitiful. But my lord, since you have promised her, don't let a girl be sad and disappointed. Perhaps Miss Delphian made the right choice this time, and only you can save her." "Medicia?" Don't treat me like a child, my lord. I have 1,000 years of experience, much more than my lord. No, Brando replied. I met your sister in the elemental frontier. Magadal and Frank's reunion was not as complicated as Brando had imagined. The moment the princess saw the old marshal, she recognized the face of the solemn portrait hanging in the middle of the castle. She recognized the old duke who had been missing for more than 50 years. On the other hand, although Frank subconsciously felt a sense of familiarity with the girl who ran out, he did not recognize her at first sight. This was understandable. After all, when he left Antoinette, Magadal was not even born yet. He had not even seen the nun princess when she was still a baby girl, so how could he recognize his granddaughter at first sight? However, what happened next was predictable. When Magadal revealed her identity, the old marshal was overjoyed. Some traditions in a large noble family could not be faked, especially for the people in the family. Besides, Brando had no reason to lie to him about this matter, so Frank believed Magadal's words almost immediately. The old marshal had left Wone for a few decades because of his cynicism, but this did not mean that he did not care about his family. It was a bond that no one could give up, not to mention the glorious bloodline that had been passed down. Magadal immediately threw herself into her grandfather's arms and burst into tears. Although she did not suffer much after the battle in Ampere Seal, now that she was tens of thousands of miles away from her hometown and in a completely unfamiliar environment, it was understandable that she could not control her emotions when she suddenly saw a legendary family member. Frank was greatly relieved, comforting his granddaughter in a soft voice while chuckling. Obviously, he was very happy to meet a descendant who was related to him by blood before returning to the land of Vaunt. However, after a short reunion, the old marshal went to find Brando in private and said, "Young Master Brando, there's something I have to tell you. I might even need your help. Please don't call me young master. Mr. Frank, if you need anything, please let me know. If there's anything I can help with, I'll do my best." Brendel felt that the way he addressed Frank made him feel uncomfortable. The old marshal sighed. "It's about Magadal." Brando was slightly taken aback. However, a hint of understanding flashed through his mind. But when he saw Frank's expression, he ruled out the possibility that the Antibureau family was plotting something. Frank obviously knew about Magadal's background, but it seemed that this was something that he could not do anything about. When this thought flashed through his mind, it naturally showed on his face. Frank looked at his expression and seemed to have understood something. "Young Master Brando, you already know?" Brendel paused for a moment, then nodded. "So," he asked, "what's the matter with Princess Magadal?" "That child," Frank sighed and said, "she's an ancient, a descendant of the ancient celestials that is even older than the golden folk." "What did you say? Magadal is a divine citizen?" Brendel's jaw dropped to the ground. "Magadal is a divine citizen? A celestial?" Frank shook his head and said, No, that child Magadal is not a celestial. You should have heard of the origin of the golden folk, Mr. Brando." Brando suppressed the shock in his heart and nodded again. Chapter 1280. Brando soon saw Medisha. Although Delphian took the initiative to apologize to her and explained clearly why she was here, the latter still looked a little unhappy when she saw her. To be exact, it was a little cold. Even Brando did not get a good look from the Silver Elf Princess for the first time. Medisha looked very serious, pursed her lips, and snorted softly to express her dissatisfaction. She didn't argue with him. Instead, she turned around and lifted the curtain, walking into the cave. Brando smiled bitterly. He certainly knew that Medisha was angry with him because of the Roman, but Delphian gave him a push from behind. He understood and hurried in. Lady White Fog was lying on the stove taking a nap. She narrowed her eyes and looked at the two of them mischievously. "Young people these days," she thought. "Medisha, how is Hippamera?" The Silver Elf Princess raised her eyes to look at him. After all, she still could not bear to have a cold war with her lord. The day when Brando saved her was still in her heart. How could she forget? Seeing that Brando immediately came in, the anger in the girl's heart dissipated by half. She frowned slightly and shook her head. "Not very good, we lack medicine and treatment here. She is badly injured, and Sopalach is a city of the undead. There is only the Temple of the Dying Moon." Lady White Fog sent the pirates to find the Water of Life, but unfortunately they found nothing. Fortunately, Miss Magadal has some knowledge of potions, and with the herb Hippamera she got better. "What about Flora, Nightsong and the others? Don't the elementalists have healing spells?" "I can't summon Flora and the others because I can't contact you, and the Planeswalker's authority can't be activated. Lady White Fog has some healing methods, but it is very limited. Hippamera was a priest herself, but she could not use Himalad's divine power when she was seriously injured. The so-called doctor does not treat himself, it was probably so helpless. In the end, Medisha added softly, if my lord came a day later, I was going to risk going to Elm Harbor to see. Brando could not help but feel ashamed. But the lost names on the sea? I can't just watch Hippamera suffer, my lord and Mr. the Shire, Andrique and her brother, we are like a family, you are like my brothers and sisters. Hippamera is strong but I can't stand it. Medisha bit her lower lip, her eyes. Brando suddenly understood where her complaints came from. He reached out and wiped the girl's eyes. It's all right now that I'm here. Take me to Hippamela, he answered softly. The Silver Elf Princess replied softly. Miss Delphian? That was a misunderstanding, Medisha, but now she is one of us, at least she won't have any other thoughts. Although I hope she can see her heart clearly earlier and stop being so paranoid, but for now this is the best result. In fact, Miss Delphian is also very pitiful, I understand, I will try to get along with her. Thank you, Medisha. I should be the one thanking you. It was Lord Medisa who gave me a new life, but in order to let Lord Medisa pay more attention to me, I couldn't help but be willful, but Lord Medisa always accommodates me. Medisa is really blessed. Brando's heart softened slightly when he heard this, and he could not help but look carefully at the Silver Elf Princess. Smart, excellent, beautiful, she had everything a young girl dreamed of, like a perfect masterpiece of Martha. The key was that it was so reassuring, like a quiet harbor that could anchor one's heart. Whenever he was with her, Brando would feel a kind of eternal peace, as if all the anxiety and worry had disappeared without a trace. This seemed to be a characteristic of the elves. It is really a blessing to be able to meet you. Brando could not help but say this in his heart. Medisa silently led the way. Sometimes she didn't need to argue, and it was enough to let the Lord understand her intentions. She knew that she was very different from Scarlet, but she would never give up what belonged to her to someone else. When Brando saw Hippamera, he understood why Medisha was so anxious. Hippamera was wrapped in bandages and there were blood stains on them. Some of them were bright red, indicating that the blood had not dried for long. She was lying on the bed, her weak body deeply buried in the pillow. There was no trace of blood on her face, as if only a pair of lively eyes were filled with the color of hope. The moment he opened the curtain and entered, Hippamera's gaze fell on him. My lord, Miss Priestess seemed to be happy, and her happy tone was exactly the same as Medisha's, which made Brando feel even more ashamed. Even though he had been worried about Medisa and the rest on his way north from Rosaline, he had put himself in their shoes and thought about the consequences of his rash decision back at Rushta. Although he did not regret going to see the Roman, he could understand why Medisha hated Delphian so much. The cave was filled with the pungent smell of medicine. Princess Magadol was dressed like a maid in Greek mythology, and there was a pot of medicine in front of her. When she saw Brando enter, her expression was full of hope. Obviously, he had left the impression that he was omnipotent, as if as long as he was here, Hippamera would undoubtedly recover. This trust was without reason, but it was incomparably firm. Thank you, Miss Magadol. Brando already knew that the princess was teleported here together with Lady White Fog. These days she had helped Medisha and Lady White Fog a lot. If not for her, Hippamera's condition would have been worse. After all, Medisha was also heavily injured in the disaster. It was said that when she was teleported, something descended on Rushta, and the turbulence in space was affected. That was why she was thrown here. And Lady White Fog was obviously better at killing people than saving people. From Medisha, Brando also knew that Andrique and Mephistopheles might not have returned to Erewhon. Only the Fireclaw Lizardman Lord and Vahina might not have been affected. Because of Hippamera's current condition, he was very worried about the vampire siblings. Princess Magadol quickly shook her head. Mr. Brando, let's not talk about this. Quickly help Miss Hippamera, her condition is very bad. Brando couldn't help but feel a pain in his heart. He saw Hippamera lying on the bed sheet in front of her, and an open book on her knees. It looked like a travel book about the 9 Phoenix and there were even engravings on it, but the quality was very poor. Miss Magadol's hobby was to read all kinds of books, especially travel books. But he didn't know where this book came from, and there were even missing pages. Her pale and thin hands were placed on the pages, and she tilted her head to look at him, with an optimistic and satisfied smile on her face. At the side of her bed there was a water tank and there were a few prawns in it. It seemed to be the source of her happiness. Although she was a warrior priestess, she didn't like to fight. Her biggest wish was to travel around and see the gifts that Mother Earth had given to this world. But because of her duty, her freedom was restricted, and Hippamera could only look for her dream world from books. She opened her mouth and wanted to say something, but Brando covered her forehead with his hand, motioning her not to move. He took out the bottle of Angel's Heart. Although Hofwold's golden wine also had healing properties, he was already traumatized by it, and would not take it out under normal circumstances. Open your mouth. Hippamera was very obedient. Everyone's eyes were focused on his actions. Brando opened the milky white bottle, and dripped a drop of the liquid that looked like pure gold on Hippamera's tongue. It was like a miracle, and in just a moment the girl's face became rosy, and her originally dry skin was filled with moisture again, becoming moist and healthy. Her withered grayish-golden hair became bright again, like silk made of pure gold, and draped over her neck. Hippamera let out a cry of surprise and sat up on the bed. The blanket immediately slid down her chest, revealing the bandages that barely covered her body. Brando felt his nose heat up and quickly turned his head away. The girl was stunned and shyly pulled up the blanket, her face a little hot. Medisha looked at the two of them in annoyance. Martha above, is this the legendary holy water #1? Princess Magadal didn't care too much and stood up from her seat in shock. She was a devout believer, and naturally had heard of the legendary holy item of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. But Brando shook his head and replied, "This is not holy water #1, this is the bottle of Angel's Heart, the miracle of the holy archangel sacrificing herself to stay in the world forever." The bottle of Angel's Heart. Medisha looked at the holy item in Brando's hand in surprise. "That is a legendary holy item, my lord, you actually got it." Although Princess Magadal had never heard of this holy item, it didn't stop her from understanding the miracle that happened just now. The fact that Miss Hippamera, who was almost taken away by the Grim Reaper, was now sitting on the bed with a radiant face was the best proof. "You always have a way." She squatted down slightly and sincerely bowed to Brando. "All of us were at our wits' end, but you always brought us hope, to my best friend Griffin and to me. Whether it was in Ampere Seal, Lone Harbor, or now, you were always able to lead us out of our predicament." Chapter 1281. I thank you from the bottom of my heart, my lord. Thank you for everything you've done for us. The same goes for your kindness, Brando replied. He naturally had a good impression of this kind-hearted princess. This nun princess didn't do anything spectacular in history, but everything she did was supported by kindness and justice. History didn't need too many revolutionaries, what it needed were thousands of people like this nun princess. He suddenly thought of something and said to Magadal, "I brought someone with me. You might want to meet him, your highness." Who is it, my lord?" Magadal was stunned. Brendel had saved her life during the battle in Ampere Seal, so their relationship was closer than the one between her and Princess Griffin, which was why she did not feel awkward when speaking to him. "It's Mr. Brando, your grandfather." "What?" Magadal was shocked. Duke Brando had disappeared in a shipwreck not long after the Holy War, at least that was what the Antiburo family claimed. It had been at least 60 years since then. Although she was not born when her grandfather went missing, she had at least heard about it. Because the Archduke's death was announced as a missing person, it wasn't that she didn't think that the other party might appear in places like Nine Phoenix, but so many years had passed, even if he was lost at sea, if he didn't die, he should have returned long ago. Although the connection between Nine Phoenix and Vaunt was blocked, it wasn't completely unrelated. She knew that her grandfather was a sword saint, and would not be hindered by a little distance. Therefore she only thought about it occasionally and treated it as a fantasy. She did not expect it to become reality one day. However, she had never seen her grandfather since she was born. She only knew that her grandfather was the most legendary hero of the Antiburo Principality. She admired her grandfather very much, but she didn't know what to do when she had to face him all of a sudden. "My grandfather? Where is he?" "He's outside. I haven't told him that you're here, so I wanted to ask for your opinion." "I'll go see him right away." "I'm sorry, Count." Princess Magadal apologized to him and was about to rush out. However, she paused for a moment and went back to tidy up her dress to see if there were any wrinkles or omissions. This behavior showed that she was at a loss for what to do. But it was understandable. After all, they were blood relatives. Although they had not seen each other for decades, they still could not let go. And Brando knew very well that if the old Duke returned to the Antiburo Principality, it would mean a lot to the Antiburo Principality. It was impossible for Magadol not to be worried. Magadol hurriedly left Brando and Medisha in the narrow stone house. Pamela thanked him softly. She was a girl who was content with what she had and had a big heart. She didn't think about how to repay him because he was her lord and her master, and that was enough. Medisha was silent for a moment before she asked, "I never thought that Princess Magadol's grandfather would be here. I heard that he went missing decades ago." "There's more to this than meets the eye. In fact, it's not like what the rumors say. But after all, it's Marshal Blanche's private matter," Brando explained. "I understand," Medisha shook her head. "But my lord, do you think that Marshal Blanche knows about Miss Magadol's existence?" Brando was silent. He did not tell Blanche about Magadol in advance because of this reason. Magadol herself might not know about the uniqueness of her body. The heart of the giant dragon in her body was originally the power core of the giant god soldier. Any ordinary person would definitely not be able to carry such a thing in their body. There was no doubt that this princess was not human. Unless she was premeditated by someone, the Antibureau family's role in this was very suspicious. But from Magadol's reaction, the possibility of the former was very slim. And the current Duke of Antibureau would definitely know about his daughter's situation. What about the previous Duke? That was hard to say. Of course, he did not want to pry into other people's privacy. He just did not want to hurt this kind princess. Perhaps not interfering was the best way to protect her. But if the Antibureau family really had bad intentions towards Magadol, then he would have to intervene. Not only was Princess Magadol the best friend of Princess Griffine, she was also the best friend of all Tanajal. During the time she lived in Abes, she had formed deep friendships with almost everyone. Such an outstanding lady, Brando would never let her get hurt, and Medisha naturally would not. Brando was silent for a moment, then suddenly took out the Angel's Heart bottle and shook it in front of the Silver Elf princess. "I heard that you were also injured. Medisha, do you need this?" Medisa was extremely intelligent. She could see through Brendel's guilty conscience and couldn't help but laugh out loud. She covered her mouth with the back of her hand and said, "There's no need for that. This is a miraculous artifact. My lord, please don't use it as a tool to please girls." "I don't have such thoughts, I'm just worried about my subordinates," the Silver Elf princess snorted softly. "Actually, I've always suspected that the relationship between Miss Delphian and my lord is not that simple." "Ahem," she raised her head and looked at him carefully. "Actually, I know what Miss Delphian is thinking. That's why I said that she was a little pitiful. But my lord, since you promised her, don't let a girl be sad and disappointed. Perhaps Miss Delphian made the right choice this time, and only you can save her. Medisha? Don't treat me like a child, my lord. I have 1,000 years of experience, much more than my lord." "No," Brando replied. "I met your sister in the elemental frontier." Magadol and Frank's reunion was not as complicated as Brando had imagined. The moment the princess saw the old marshal, she recognized the face of the solemn portrait hanging in the middle of the castle. She recognized the old duke who had been missing for more than 50 years. On the other hand, although Frank subconsciously felt a sense of familiarity with the girl who ran out, he did not recognize her at first glance. This was understandable. After all, when he left Antibureau, Magadol was not even born yet. He did not even get to see the nun princess when she was still a baby girl. How could he recognize his granddaughter at a glance? However, what happened next was predictable. When Magadol revealed her identity, the old marshal could not help but be overjoyed. Some traditions in a large noble family could not be faked, especially for the people in the family. Besides, Brando had no reason to lie to him about this matter, so Frank believed Magadol's words almost immediately. The old marshal had left Wone for a few decades because of his cynicism, but this did not mean that he did not care about his family. It was a bond that no one could give up, not to mention the glorious bloodline that had been passed down. Magadol immediately threw herself into her grandfather's arms and burst into tears. Ever since the Battle of Ampere Seal, she had not suffered much. But now that she was tens of thousands of miles away from her hometown and in a completely unfamiliar environment, it was understandable that she would lose control of her emotions when she suddenly saw her legendary relative. Frank was greatly relieved, comforting his granddaughter in a soft voice while chuckling. Obviously, he was very happy to meet a descendant who was related to him by blood before returning to the land of Vaunt. However, after a short reunion, the old marshal went to find Brando in private and said, "Young Master Brando, there is something I have to tell you. I might even need your help." "Please don't call me young master." Brando only felt that this form of address made him feel uncomfortable. Mr. Frank, if you have anything to tell me, I will do my best to help. The old marshal sighed. It's about Magadol. Brando was slightly stunned. However, a trace of understanding flashed in his heart. He thought to himself as expected. But looking at Frank's expression, he ruled out the possibility that the Antibureau family was plotting something. Frank obviously knew about Magadol's background, but it seemed that this was something that he could not do anything about. This thought flashed through his mind and naturally, it showed on his face. Frank looked at his expression and seemed to have understood something. Young Master Brando, you already know? Brendel paused for a moment, then nodded. So, he asked, what's the matter with Princess Magadol? That child? Frank sighed. She probably does not belong to our era, but is a descendant of the ancient celestial race that is even older than the Golden Folk. What did you say? Magadol is a divine citizen? Brendel's jaw dropped to the ground. Magadol is a divine citizen? A celestial? Frank shook his head. No, that child Magadol is not a celestial. You should have heard of the origins of the Golden Folk, Mr. Brando. I think Magadol is a celestial. Brendel suppressed the shock in his heart and nodded again. Chapter 1282. Not only did Brando understand the Golden Folk, he knew them far better than Brando had imagined. The Golden Folk had the blood of warriors flowing through their veins. This was not a joke because they were born to fight, and the Golden Folk themselves often saw it as a kind of glory. They were the warriors of the gods. The gods created the Golden People in order to fight against the Dusk. Compared to the Silver People who were more like scholars than warriors, the Silver Elves were the best at fighting, and they were also the guardians of many rituals and culture. The Golden People were the main counterattack force in the world of order during the Age of Glory. However, the gods created the Golden Folk with the intention of creating a race with the power of the gods, but with a large number of people so that they could fight against the equally large Twilight Army. This process was not done overnight. Over the long years, the gods had made many attempts, but quality and quantity always seemed to be difficult to balance. Before the appearance of the mature and powerful Golden Folk such as the dragons, the gods had many ideas, and some of the species born in between were actually not the Golden Folk. It was not until the gods finally found a way to solve the problem, creating the Myrna people who were not powerful, but had the greatest potential of all the Golden Folk. Before they came up with the mortal plan, the number of their failed works in the long river of history far exceeded the number of their successful works. But some of them were not worthless. And these beings who were born before the Golden Folk were not the Golden Folk but the Ancient Folk. Some of them were even more powerful than the Golden Folk, and their strength was no less than that of the gods. For example, the famous demon infant Sodria in the history of Vaunt, the nightmare of the gods, had even killed a divine folk. Some of them were not powerful, and there were even some who did not have the slightest bit of power, and were called the Ancient Folk. But most of these Ancient Folk were annihilated in history. After all, before the stars fell, there was no land for mortals to live in Wonde. But there were still some who survived. In Brando's knowledge of history, there were traces of them in Wonde as well, though they were few in number and not powerful. These weak ancient survivors mostly lived in the Broken Sword mountain range north of the Temple of the Earth. Coincidentally, all of the truly powerful ancient citizens, including Sodria, had perished without exception. Instead, it was the lowly mortals who had survived. Even though their living conditions were bleak, at least they had stubbornly survived. Sometimes, Brando even suspected that the gods had found inspiration in this matter and created the Myrnas. They even abandoned the plan of the Golden Race and started the Age of Black Iron. These were crystalline life forms that looked like crystal clusters. Some were pure energy life forms and some were elemental life forms. Others looked more like constructs such as the Crus men. Their bodies were made of metal and they fed on iron. They looked like life forms, but they were very different from the Golden Race and the Silver Race. They also did not fit in with the Black Iron Race. Speaking of which, Princess Magadol was indeed very similar to them. She had a heartbeat, blood circulation and even metabolism. She had emotions, intelligence, and her appearance was almost the same as a human's. Even she did not doubt this. But she was not human. Sometimes Brando wondered if he was human. He had a system that no one else could see, and he had high authority in Martha's divine council. He also had the heart of the storm in his body that was similar to the heart of the dragon. But there was one thing he was sure of. He and Brando's parents were the purest humans. Even Darius, the Sword Saint, was born and raised in Erewhon. He did not even have the slightest trace of the noble elven bloodline that the nobles were proud of. To be more precise, he was a typical country bumpkin. And before the heart of the dragon was implanted, his body was also purely human. From his appearance to his internal organs to his bones, there was not a trace of abnormality. Even before the orb of nature perfected his bloodline, the blood that flowed in his body was what the Silver Queen called the dirty red blood. But Magadol was completely different. This princess could be said to only be human on the surface. Perhaps she had the emotions and intelligence of a human, as well as a sense of identity. But her body was indeed a construct. Such a strange life form could only have been the work of a mad wizard who was arrogant enough to challenge the realm of the gods. But the wizards, including the Bugas, could never solve the problem of the soul and emotion, and they did not even go as far as their fellow necromancers in this regard. Although the poor liches of Madara still did not understand the principles of their spells, it was hard to say if they were more pitiful than the Bugas. So when Blanche said that Princess Magadol was an ancient, Brando could accept it. But what made Brando a little surprised was how the Antibureau family knew about this. In his opinion, this small duchy, which drifted away from the upper circle of the Kurlutz people, was once very dutiful in history. Although there were some trivial and melodramatic things, they were not out of the scope of ordinary nobles. And how did they come to be related to Magadol? If the princess was really from the ancient era, then how did they come to be related to her? He was familiar with the Golden Race because he knew too much about them in both his previous and current lives. Especially in this life, because of his grandfather, he learned many secrets from the Bugas, from the Silver Queen and many other people that he had never known before. That was how he learned about the plan of the gods, and learned about the Dark Dragon and everything that happened in the past. And in fact, for many people living in this land in this era, including the nobles, the only thing they knew about the Golden Race was the dragons, just like how many people only knew that the Bugas were silver wizards, and they did not even know about the silver elves. To be able to say that the Golden Race was created by the divine people, and even to be able to confirm the existence of the divine people was a very remarkable thing in itself, and that was at least the domain of a senior scholar. And to know the difference between the ancient race and the Golden Race was even rarer. Brando looked at Blanche, hoping that the marshal could give him a satisfactory answer. You know the origin of the Golden Race? Blanche was more surprised than him. I understand the Bugas told you. After all, they had some connections with your grandfather. That's right, you know about the divine people. That makes things easier. The old marshal sighed. In fact, the Antibureau family already knew about the existence of the divine people before that incident happened. Brando knew that the so-called incident was the incident that happened on the final battlefield 60 years ago. Although the marshal did not personally experience it, he should have been involved in the aftermath. He did not open his mouth to speak, nor did he deny the misunderstanding. Brendel knew that the marshal would have a lot to say next. Sure enough, Blanche continued with a sigh. The Antibureau family knew the secret behind this because of Magadol. Marshal, so you should have recognized Magadol long ago? Brando suddenly realized this. Blanche laughed bitterly. I could only pretend that way, Master Brando. You should understand that we had no other choice. That child is actually very sensitive, and I don't want her to realize that she is different from others. No matter what, she is still a kind child and should not be hurt because of this. Brando suddenly understood, and he could not help but sigh in his heart. Although the marshal usually looked serious in front of him, he was actually an Oscar-level actor. Not to mention Magadol, even he did not have the slightest suspicion at that time. Life is like a drama and it all depends on acting. But you can't hide it forever. Lies cannot protect people and will only hurt her more, Marshal. Brando's ears twitched slightly, and he suddenly heard light footsteps coming from afar. It was not Medicia's footsteps, and it was obviously not Delphian's either. Brando instantly knew whose footsteps it was. He subconsciously wanted to remind the marshal, but after thinking about it, he swallowed his words. Since she came here quietly, it meant that she might have doubts in her heart. It was not important when this suspicion arose. What was important was that concealing it could be done with good intentions, but deliberate deception may cause an irreparable rift between the Antibureau family and Magadol. We have no other choice. This is related to another secret. I will tell you slowly later, Master Brando. After saying this, Blanche's face suddenly changed. It was obvious that he had also heard the footsteps. Although his strength was slightly inferior to Brando's, Magadol was just an ordinary person. It was impossible for her to hide in front of two Supreme Realm experts. But Brando said, Marshal, if you can recognize Magadol, it means that she is definitely not your granddaughter, right? Blanche was slightly taken aback and he looked at Brando with some confusion. But Brando shook his head at him sternly. This marshal had lived an illustrious life, and had experienced countless storms and waves. It was obvious that he was not completely ignorant of the human heart. In fact, it was the opposite. With his sharp mind, he instantly understood what Brando meant. Chapter 1283. After hesitating for a moment, Blanche sighed and said, "Yes, Magadol was actually discovered by my grandfather." What? Brando was shocked. He thought that Magadol might be from the same generation as the current patriarch of the Antibureau family, but he did not expect her to be from the same generation as the marshal in front of him. At the same time, he heard the sound of footsteps in his ears. "You're right, young Master Brando. I grew up with Magadol." Blanche smiled bitterly. At that time, very few people knew the secret behind Magadol, including me. Everyone thought that she was my sister. Then, something happened. Blanche slowly recounted the story that happened nearly 100 years ago. About 4 generations ago, the Duke of Antibureau discovered Magadol in a special experience. Realizing that the girl was extraordinary, he brought Magadol back to the duchy and told her story to a few people, strictly ordering them to keep it a secret. Among these people was Blanche's father, and the little girl was designated to him as his daughter. As Blanche described, he took out an item from his pocket. Brando saw that it was a piece of rusty metal about the size of a palm, and it seemed to be painted. The old marshal rubbed the piece of metal affectionately as he spoke. He looked at the piece of metal carefully before handing it over. "We confirmed that Magadol was an ancient because of this. I should have left it to my useless son, but I left in a hurry. I was worried that it would bring trouble to Magadol, so I took it with me." Brando took the piece of metal and glanced at it. He frowned. To be exact, it was an ordinary piece of metal. It was very thin, only a few millimeters thick. It was a little bent and covered with a layer of red rust. But the rust could not hide the paint that was painted on it. It was a layer of blue paint with a white border. There was a line of small letters engraved on it. Umsots Ruptaslames X 00432408 RU 433W. 1044 Stem 25th. No matter how he looked at it, there seemed to be nothing out of the ordinary. But Brando knew that this thing should not exist in this world. It was a production nameplate. He was very familiar with the words on it. It was at least an ancient language from a few years ago. After seeing it many times, he gradually learned how to read it. Although he could not understand it word by word, he could at least roughly understand the meaning of the nameplate. Experimental subject number X 00432408 was located in sequence 433. It was located in a production workshop or laboratory called RTU. In short, it had a similar meaning. Finally, there was time. It was a method that he had never heard of before. It was a method that might have lasted for more than 1,000 years. So what was this? He looked at the small piece of metal in his hand, and his heart was filled with questions. A transmigrator like himself? From Earth? Or from another time and space? Or was it a gadget that the planeswalkers brought from a parallel dimension? He raised his head and looked at Blanche. He knew that the marshal would definitely give him an explanation. This is something that was found with Magadol. Brando heard the sound of something falling to the ground. He turned to look in that direction and the sound immediately disappeared. Frank was also looking in that direction worriedly, but he continued, "To be exact, my grandfather found Magadol in a huge metal container in the Broken Sword Mountains. At that time he could not get the entire container out, but he found a baby girl in it. In order to prove it, he tore off this nameplate from the container. Do you know what this is?" Brando asked. Frank shook his head. "We only know that it is an ancient language. My grandfather looked up a lot of information and documents about this. Since then, we have learned about the relationship between the Golden Race and the Divine People. It was also at that time that the Antibureau family began to approach the Holy Cathedral of Fire to investigate Magadol's background." "What about that place, the place where you found Magadol?" "It disappeared." "Disappeared?" "My grandfather and my father went there later, but before that, there was an earthquake in the Broken Sword Mountains. That place was originally the hive area of Georgindy Ridge, but it was buried because of it." Brando pursed his lips. His heart was pounding. There was a very interesting fact. Almost all of the ancient people devoutly believed in Mother Earth Gaia because they believed that they came from the same place. That place was buried in the mountains, deep in the earth, under layers of silver plains. There was a silver kingdom. Mother Earth Gaia protected every one of her children. Until one day when the children grew up, the gate opened in front of them and everyone came to the earth. This was a scene described in the myths of the ancient people. Their religious ceremonies also repeatedly repeated the scene of them coming out of the mountains, and the witch doctors and priests passed down this history by word of mouth. What was more interesting was that the rune dwarves also believed in this legend. Thinking about it carefully, this history was very similar to the one in Odin's memory. Before the destruction of the rune dwarven empire, the entire empire was also searching for the silver plains described in the dream. The rune dwarves also believed in the goddess of the earth, Gaia, and they also worshipped Haurang Gaia as a sacred sword. He could not help but suspect that there might be a fortress like Babel in the depths of the earth. Countless years ago, this fortress history might be even more glorious than Babel, and Valhalla was not even worth mentioning in comparison. Valhalla only carried the history of the golden race, and the silver plains in the dreams of the rune dwarves was the homeland of all the ancient people. But if Princess Magadol was also an ancient, then did she also come from this place? Coincidentally, the head of the Antiburo family 2 generations ago, Brando's grandfather, found Magadol in the Broken Sword Mountains. Brando could only think of one thing from the description of the metal container and the nameplate: a petri dish. With Brando's own knowledge, he should not have known this term. But he was very clear that the other soul in his body, which came from Sophie's soul, was telling him the truth. The metal container that contained Magadol in her infant form was a petri dish. The place where it was located was very likely the place called the RTU laboratory on the nameplate. And that place might have been a part of the Silver Plains. Then there was a question. What exactly was the Silver Plains? Why would there be such a thing there? Brando's mind was filled with countless questions and guesses, and every question made him tremble. Thousands of guesses and thoughts seemed to be circling in his mind, and finally, they all turned into a question. Who was it, and what method did they use to create the ancient people? Who were the ancient people? His mind was blank, and at this time the girl hiding in the darkness could not take it anymore. Princess Magadol burst into tears the moment she found out the truth. She covered her mouth and let out a low sob, and stumbled backwards as if she wanted to escape from this place. But in her panic she lost her footing and fell to the ground. When she got up again she even lost one of her shoes. Stop her. Brando reacted, and did not have time to think about the huge suspicion in his heart. He looked deeply at the metal plate in his hand, then turned around and said sternly to Brando. In fact, there was no need for him to remind him, as Brando had already chased after her. When Brando followed, he just happened to see the marshal holding the crying nun princess in his arms, looking up at him silently. Count? Mr. Brando? Princess Magadol saw Brando coming over, and her eyes were red, but she quickly wiped away the tears on her cheeks and hurriedly thanked him. Thank you. She obviously understood that if it were not for Brando, the Antiburo family would not know how long they would have kept it from her. But in this matter she knew that she could not resent the family that raised her. In fact, even now she had never acknowledged herself as a member of the family. Not to mention that Brando, who was now her grandfather, had already told her about this matter. Miss Magadol, actually, I have also kept it from you. Ever since the Battle of Ampere Seal, Medisha and I have already discovered that you are different from us. Brando shook his head and said to her, You don't have to blame yourself for this, Mr. Brando. I understand you, and I also understand my family. Princess Magadol seemed to have recovered some of her emotions, and she said somewhat dejectedly, No matter who it is, when faced with this kind of situation, it is difficult to make a choice. You are also trying to protect me. What a kind girl, Brando could not help but think. She always thinks of others first and rarely cares about her own situation. Actually, this is nothing, he replied, and it is not scary. The Buga people are also very different from us, but we still live in harmony with them, and we have never thought of them as a different race. Princess Magadol was stunned, and did not quite understand why Brando would suddenly mention this to her. Brendel glanced at her and continued, What I mean is, humans are not the only race in this world. There's nothing strange about that. The key is that your relationship with the Antiburo family doesn't change because you're an elf, dwarf, or any other race. This relationship is something that can't be cut off. Hearing this, Marshal Blanche could not help but nod, and turned to look at Brando gratefully. But, Princess Magadol looked a little sad. A person like me, is it really a life? Perhaps I was created by someone else. Of course, whether you were created by someone else or not, you have feelings and you have a soul. There is no doubt that all of us were created by Lady Martha, right? Brando thought that it was fortunate that there were gods in this world. Sure enough, after hearing his explanation, Princess Magadol's expression became much better. Thank you. She replied softly, Mr. Brando, thank you. But I don't quite understand what is going on between you and Mr. Blanche. Brando asked. Logically speaking, you should know Mr. Blanche, right? Sigh, this is where I need your help, young Master Brando. Marshal Blanche heard this and sighed deeply. Magadol has always been in danger and has never been an exception. P.S. Yesterday I remembered the heart of the dragon in Magadol's body as the heart of the storm, and forced myself to switch hearts with Brando. I don't know if Brando secretly took advantage of the girl. I am guilty, it is all my fault, and I have already corrected myself. Chapter 1284. In fact, young Master Brando, Magadol's memories have always been in a state of amnesia. Every once in a while she would seal off her past memories. This may be a form of protection because it has something to do with her nemesis. Nemesis? Marshal Blanche shook his head and continued, the only memory I have with Magadol is when my father and grandfather were still alive. At that time she was still my sister. We were still young then and my father and grandfather did not tell me anything about Magadol's past. But as I grew older, Magadol's appearance seemed to be fixed at the age of 19. We gradually felt that it was a little strange, but at that time, we also thought that Magadol's mother might be an elf, because I always knew that Magadol was my half-sister from a different mother. When I officially became the head of the family, my grandfather had already passed away for 13 years. My father was also getting old. One day he called me to his study room and told me everything about Magadol. At first, I was naturally very shocked and I could not even face her. But as time passed, I gradually learned to accept everything. I thought, Magadol is my sister, a member of the Antiburo family. I grew up with her and we have countless beautiful memories. These memories between siblings are inseparable, so why should I deny it? After making this decision, I had a long talk with Magadol and told her the truth. My father, who was the previous head of the Antiburo family, agreed with my decision, because we could not hide it from her forever. That should be Magadol's first memory. I remember telling her this secret in the inner courtyard of the Antiburo family's castle. In my memory there was a small garden, and in the flower bed were some purple gentian. This flower was very popular among the nobles at that time, and there were a few bees flying around the white flowers of the pagoda tree. It was afternoon and the sun was very bright. After listening to my words, Magadol was very calm. Magadol's mouth was slightly open, and she was a little lost in thought. She did not have any impression of this memory at all, but she could tell from Blanche's tone and details that his memories of that era must be beautiful and warm, just like the afternoon sun that he described. His tone revealed a sense of familial love and reminiscence, like dust floating under the warm sun. It was faint but full of warmth. Blanche looked at Magadol and his eyes were full of love. As my sister, Magadol was very different from you. She was calm, decisive, and very assertive. The only similarity between you and her was that you both had a pure and flawless heart. The Antiburo family's guild that helped the poor was founded by you, but they always thought she was your grandmother. Ah, no wonder they were so good to me, Magadol exclaimed. The Holy Cathedral of Fire also talked to me about my grandmother a few times, and they also mentioned the Guild of Saint Vienne and my grandmother. But I have no impression of her at all. At that time I felt strange and ashamed and felt that I had lied to them. But I could not deny my grandmother's past. That was something that happened later. When she found out the truth, she appeared less in the duchy. She began to travel to places like Cruz and Erewhon for long periods of time. I know that she was looking for her origins, and my father and I have been very supportive of her. Magadol, if my grandfather and father wanted to know your secret at the beginning, but after so many years of living together, we actually treated you as a member of the Antiburo family. Just like us, you are our family. The nun princess pursed her lips and sniffed gently. Thank you. I have always treated you as my family. Even now that has never changed. Frank smiled with relief but then shook his head. This continued until my father passed away. At that time something happened. After attending the family funeral, she embarked on a journey to Cruz. On the surface she was invited by the Holy Cathedral of Fire to participate in the spring festival, but in reality she was going to the Broken Sword Mountains to look for the place where we found you. This was the third time she went to the Broken Sword Mountains. Because the previous few times were very successful, I did not think too much about it. I only asked a team of family knight to accompany her. In fact, I was already the de facto leader of the Antiburo family at that time, and the burden on my shoulders was very heavy. It was as if there was an endless amount of work to do. As my sister, she was very clear about this. Even before she left, she only met me briefly. But I did not expect that she would be gone for 3 years. The Holy Cathedral believed that she and the entourage of the delegation had disappeared when they were passing through the sublime inland sea. After that, there was no news of her. But only I knew that she did not go missing in the sublime inland sea. She must have met with some trouble in the Broken Sword Mountains. After that, I frequently went to cruise. In the eyes of outsiders, it was to strengthen the relationship with the Empire, but in fact, it was to find her. Just like that, 3 years later, one night, I still clearly remember the bright moonlight of that night. The silver moonlight shone through the window onto my desk. I had just finished dealing with the dispute between the Wind Elves and the Sacred Guild, blew out the candles, and was about to go back to my room to sleep when my sister appeared in front of me just like that. She was covered in blood and severely injured. She jumped in through the window and grabbed me. She told me in an urgent tone that she was in trouble and that something terrible was chasing after her. At that time, I angrily asked her where she had been these days, and why she didn't contact her family. At the same time, I pulled the bell on the desk to call for help. At that time, she looked very scary and I was very worried. When she stopped me and said that she needed my help to hide what happened next, I did not understand what she was talking about at first. Later, I realized that she must have understood a lot of things at that time. She must have gained a lot from her trip to the Broken Sword Mountains, but she did not have the time to tell us. So, I quietly cleaned up the blood in the room and another person cleaned up the traces in the courtyard outside. Then, I hid her in the cellar according to her request. I brought her some medicine but she didn't use it. It wasn't until the morning of the third day that I saw her again. That meeting was also in my study. I was originally feeling uneasy but she quietly snuck in. Her injuries were almost completely healed and she gave me a very strange feeling. That feeling was as if the person in front of me wasn't my sister, but another stranger. Magadol seemed to have understood something. She moved her lips and wanted to say something, but no sound came out. That's the second you. Very few people know about your existence. She sealed most of her memories and this scary thing didn't seem to find her again. But she's a little different from the current you. She still retains some memories of the past. She's naturally close to those who are familiar with her, such as me and my brothers and sisters, Blanche replied. Because of this reason, very few outsiders knew of her existence. She was actually your mother, the rumored sickly lady. We claimed that she married a noble from the White Mountain area. In order to recuperate, she basically lived in seclusion. She died at the age of 33. You could say that she died young, but in fact she lived much longer than that. She had an exclusive laboratory under the castle and a mage tower. In fact, most of the time we did not know what she was doing. That was how it was until you were born. Before you were born, Magadol, the second you left me a letter. In the letter, she explained that she had sealed her memories for the second time. She had created a new identity for herself, which is your current life. In the letter, she had given up on the secret of her past, and only hoped that you could live a peaceful life as a member of the Antibureau family. I heard from Mr. Brando that all these years, you had done everything you could for the Antibureau family. You had won a lot of prestige and power for the family in the Empire. Perhaps this was the wish she left behind in your heart. Magadol looked at the old man and opened her mouth, but she did not know what to say for a moment. But Brando shook his head. Call me grandfather. The current you no longer has any connection with the past. Magadol, I followed the request of the second you in the letter and brought you back from the non-existent father of the White Mountain. I allowed you to become a member of the Antibureau family again. From then on, you are Magadol, my granddaughter. Grandfather? The old marshal nodded at her and smiled with relief. The old man raised his head and looked at Brando. Young Master Brando, I am already old. If Magadol was just an ordinary person, I would not make things difficult for you. But I know my son's ability. He may not be stupid, but he is not a smart person either. Chapter 1285. Perhaps the current generation of the Antibureau family can protect Magadol as an ordinary person, but they can't protect the real her. I know that the mystery surrounding her has never dissipated. Perhaps at some point in time that terrifying thing will come back. If possible, I hope you can help the Antibureau family. I may not have been able to help Mr. Darius back then, but I have always been loyal to the Marshal. I hope you can agree to the request of a dying man like me for the sake of my old face. Grandfather? Princess Magadol whispered, You don't have to do this? Brando looked at the two of them and shook his head. Mr. Brando, my grandfather passed away early, but you are still in the prime of your life. I believe that with your abilities, protecting Magadol will not be a problem. But if that day really comes, I will definitely take action. Not because of your request but because Princess Magadal is also my friend. Mr. Brando, Magadal looked at him gratefully. Thank you. Your grandfather was just as heroic back then, it's exactly the same. The old marshal sighed. It's no longer appropriate for me to return to Antiburo now. Back then I wasn't able to follow the marshal. Now that I'm able to serve his descendants who are just as outstanding, perhaps it's a way to make up for my regrets. Brando was stunned for a moment, then suddenly felt as if he had picked up 5 million gold coins on the street. As the saying goes, every veteran of the war was a precious treasure, and Duke Brando was definitely one of the top veterans. In other words, if the Amber Sword was a pay-to-win game, then this marshal would be the legendary embark card with a plus card, and it would be the best of the best. In the previous world, this card's only regret was that it was not a soft girl. However, Brando did not care about this at the moment. What did it mean to be a former marshal of the Allied forces? Just the title of the White Wolf Sword Saint was enough to smash a hole in the kingdom of Erewhon. It was not that he did not have such thoughts, but no matter what, Brando was still the Grand Duke of the Antiburo Duchy. Not to mention the status of the duchy as the former head of the Antiburo family, he could be said to be an emperor. How could he become a retainer under Brando? Brando's highest wish was to build a good relationship with the Grand Duke, and strengthen the relationship between Erewhon and the Antiburo family. If possible, it could make the two countries advance and retreat together, that would be the best. After all, it was much easier for small countries to work together to fight against the giants. But now he suddenly felt as if a ton of meat pie had fallen from the sky and smashed him half to death. It was as if he had just received a complicated main storyline quest, and the system had immediately given him an unprecedented epic reward. This feeling was not something that could be described as a dance of ecstasy. He quickly said, Mr. Marshal, please don't say that. If you want to come to Erewhon, then I will definitely welcome you. This would be the highest honor for Tonajal. It would not be an exaggeration to say that you bring light to my humble dwelling. Brando looked at Magadal and shook his head with a smile. Brando originally had a lot of questions to ask, whether it was about Magadal, the piece of metal in his hand, or the damn silver planes. But looking at the grandfather and granddaughter, it seemed like they had a lot to talk about. After thinking about it, he felt that it was better for him not to be an eyesore. Moreover, to be able to gain the loyalty of a former deputy marshal of the Allied forces was already a pleasant surprise for him. After all, whether it was Magadal's background or the silver planes, it actually had nothing to do with him. In comparison, if Erewhon had a commander like Brando, even if the latter could not stand in front of the stage due to his identity, it would be enough to hang up the bones of Madara who were invading Erewhon and beat them up. After all, the military force that Madara used to invade Erewhon was actually a new army used by the Kingdom of the Dead Moon to train their soldiers. Whether it was the high-level combat power, the experience of the commanders, or the investment of high-grade soldiers, it was far inferior to the investment of the Kingdom of the Dead Moon on the other fronts. Although there might be a few geniuses, these geniuses had not had the time to mature and were not a concern for the time being. Not to mention that Insursta and Tarkus were still by his side, and it seemed like they did not participate in the Second War of the Black Rose. And from their tone, the brighter genius Greta was also not in Erewhon. Just the Crimson Knight Ladios alone would not be able to support this war. So he bid farewell to Magadal and Brando and returned to the cave where the pirates were hiding. He found Lady White Fog resting by the fire. He could not let the others wait for too long, and it was not safe outside. Lady White Fog in her cat form had obviously heard Brando's footsteps long ago. She rested her face on her paws, and her ears twitched slightly. She opened one of her light blue eyes to look at Brando, and then closed it again. She replied, "Have you finally appeased your little lovers one by one?" "Lady White Fog," Brando said seriously, "can we talk about the fog outside?" "That won't do. The Witch Empress told me to keep a close eye on you. In the blink of an eye, you are out fooling around outside. When the Witch Empress comes back, how am I going to explain it to her?" Lady White Fog replied casually. "Lady White Fog." Brando did not know whether to laugh or cry. "All right, I'm just joking with you. Young people, you are so thin-skinned. You have to admit what you have done. Actually, this is not a big deal. That guy who looks serious on the surface has a few little lovers in private." He thought that the Witch Empress did not know. That guy? Of course it's Odin. Brando suddenly felt cold sweat on his back. He wondered if he would be killed after hearing these ancient secrets. He thought that the Dark Dragon and the Witch Empress would not be so calculative with a junior like him. "But I'm also reminding you to be careful. Don't let your backyard catch fire. Mistress of the White Mist. Those are the unnamed ones. Don't tell me you don't recognize them? Only then did White Fog open her eyes again. She stood up, stretched her two front paws on the ground, waved her tail and replied, "What do you want to know about them?" Brando thought for a moment and replied, "Humans know little about the unnamed ones. Some scholars think that they travel around Wonde in a fixed route. Based on observations from various places, it seems to be the case. The areas where the unnamed ones appear more often form a closed ring around Wonde. It's just that people don't know much about the part of this line that extends into the Great Glacier." He added, "In fact, people don't know much about the Great Glacier itself." However, he did not say that the so-called some scholars' view was actually the general understanding of later generations. However, his memory of the information on the forum had become more and more vague recently. Brando sometimes wondered if he had Alzheimer's disease in advance. However, one thing he at least knew was that until the Year of the Stars, the players knew little about the Great Glacier. It was an area with a higher level than the Nine-Headed Phoenix. After the Battle of the Oblique Forest, until Madara occupied the area east of the Algash Mountains, the players had formed several expeditions before, but they were all wiped out under the extreme weather changes in the Great Glacier. White Fog stretched and licked her paws. "Isn't that all the details? In that case, what else do you want to know?" "That's not what I'm concerned about, Lady White Fog." Brando shook his head. "I'm concerned about how large the area covered by this fog is. I want to avoid it by going deep inland, but I can't make up my mind because I'm not sure if I can succeed, and I don't know how much danger I'll have to take. I wonder if you have any suggestions for me?" "How do you know I do?" "Medisha told me," Brando said bluntly. "She said that you were the one who taught the pirates how to avoid the sea fog during your stay here. It's all thanks to your guidance that you were able to stay here for so long. It's not the same a few days ago." White Fog shook her head and replied, "To be honest, if it wasn't for the fact that I had no other choice, I would have already brought Medisa and the others away from this place. To anyone staying in the world, fog won't end well. Please don't take my choice as a sign of my confidence." World fog. It's just a name. Let's not talk about that for now. However, I do have something to tell you about the movements of the unnamed. "I'm all ears, Lady White Fog." "This matter may have nothing to do with the fog, but it may have something to do with it. I saw it with my own eyes, but I need further confirmation. As early as a week ago, there was a great battle between the undead and the crystal clusters on the border less than 100 miles south of Sopalach. I happened to be there to witness the battle. I saw the undead retreating to the north, and countless crystal clusters coming from the horizon. At that time, I left the battlefield in the opposite direction of the undead army's retreat. I suspect that the appearance of the unnamed may have something to do with this battle. Because of a legend." "A legend?" Chapter 1286. The Black Rose of Roman Tua was retreating north. This was the second time Brando had heard similar news in a month, but the situation in the news seemed to be worse. The defeat of the undead at Rosaline seemed to have led to their defeat on the entire front. The battle that Lady White Fog witnessed a week ago in the south of Sopalach was not too far away. The Crystal Army might have even been stationed in an area near Sopalach. Of course, they might also be heading in the direction of Lubick, because Lady White Fog said that she and the undead retreated in the opposite direction. If the army of the undead retreated all the way along the southern part of the Sea of the Dead Moon, the Crystal Army might also pursue them in that direction. "What legend?" he asked. "In the era of the Myurnas, some ancient legends mentioned that the lost names marched around Wonde to protect the world." "What? How is that possible?" "This legend is a bit old. It's normal that you haven't heard of it. It has been circulating on the earth for a long time in the era of the Myurnas." Brando, think about it carefully. How did the lost names march around Wonde? Brando recalled the route of the lost names and found that whether it was in Erewhon, Cruz or somewhere else, it just separated the Land of Order from the Black Forest. Although there were some places that were not like this, most of those places were territories that humans later opened up, such as the southern part of Erewhon. It's very special. You want to say that the lost names came from the war between the undead and the Crystal Army, Lady White Fog? The war between the undead and the Crystal Army? Lady White Fog jumped onto the exhaust pipe of the stove and looked down at him. "Brendel, do you know why I'm suddenly talking to you about these irrelevant things? Because I want you to go through this fog and see for yourself the battlefield of this war." Brando was stunned. He did not expect Lady White Fog to suddenly mention this. Shouldn't they be discussing how to safely avoid the fog? "I don't quite understand." He frowned and asked. "You will understand. Aren't you curious as to why the Silver Queen is so hysterical? Haven't you been searching for the truth of what happened to your grandfather 60 years ago? Perhaps when you see that scene you will understand. She took 2 elegant steps on the exhaust pipe, curled her tail and said in a unique tone. Since we came to this place I've been thinking about why we came here. We entered the elemental frontier from Rushta. Even if the flow of magic deviated, it shouldn't have sent us out of the world of order, tens of thousands of miles away from Wond. Until I saw that war, I had a thought in my mind. Perhaps there was a will that was hinting something to me. Perhaps it was Lady Tada, the Dragon Queen, the Witch Empress, or perhaps it was an even greater will. But none of this is important. Brando, this thought became extremely clear the moment I saw you. Do you know what that is? Brando looked at her silently. Speaking of this, Lady White Fog turned around and looked at Brando. The prismatic pupils in her eyes were vertical. I came to this era with a mission. I know everything that happened in that era. But now, very few people are familiar with that history. The sages left many words for the future generations. I think it's time to tell you some of the truth. Brando lowered his head as if he was thinking. Are you serious, Lady White Fog? He looked up again and asked, You want us to go through that fog? Brando, have I ever lied to you? I understand. I trust you, Lady White Fog. But what about the others? They have nothing to do with this. Lady White Fog jumped down from the exhaust pipe and landed lightly on the ground. She looked up at him and said, Do you really think they have nothing to do with this? Brando shut his mouth. Take them all to sea, Brando, Lady White Fog said. You're not the savior and neither is Odin. He just told me that he understood it too late. Everyone has to learn how to save themselves, but before that, they have to understand what kind of danger they're in. Brando did not expect that he would get such an answer, but there seemed to be no better way. He knew that Lady White Fog would not lie to him. She was the spirit of an ancient witch from an era ago. No one here knew more about this mysterious knowledge than she did. He could only trust her for now unless he stubbornly found his own way. But Brando was never that kind of person. He thought for a while and decided to follow this path. Lady White Fog seemed to want to show everyone something. He had some guesses, but everything could only be revealed after he saw it. Subconsciously he did not want to believe it. Because if all of this was true, then it would be too hopeless. Brando returned to the team with this thought. Insursta and Tarkus had been waiting for a long time, but the thing the undead did not lack the most was time. They had almost an eternity to wait and did not have the worries of mortals. On the other hand, the people on the Phantom Chariot's side were a little anxious. This anxiety did not only come from the uneasy waiting, but also from the fear of an unknown fate. This was especially obvious in the leaders. Fang Qi and the 2 Phantom Chariot elders did not seem to be afraid, because they knew their situation better. Influenced by them, the servants were more or less performing much better than the sailors. When Brando returned to the team, Insursta had gotten to know Medisha, the little silver elf princess. His attitude was surprisingly good, and he even asked about Medisha's past experiences. However, it was not because the little princess was a rare beauty, but because Medisha's cavemen and tree elf guards fought against Madara at the end of the First War of the Black Rose. Her opponent was the rising star of the Dead Moon Empire. The temporary beauty of humans was so fragile in the eyes of eternity. Even the elves were just bones that rotted slower. However, a good commander knew how to respect an equally good opponent, because only the latter could show the value of their existence. In comparison, beauties like Hippamera and Princess Magadol were much duller in the eyes of Insursta. They were just names or code names and did not attract his attention. On the other hand, Fang Qi was very attentive, but when he saw Brando appear, his face immediately fell, and he obediently hid in a corner. Obviously, the experience in Port Gassel had left a psychological shadow on this proud son of heaven. Brendel ordered everyone to regroup and set off, but he dismissed the pirates under White Mist's command. These people had committed all sorts of crimes and he really did not want to bring them along. He did not immediately execute them because they had helped White Mist a lot in the past few days. However, the pirates did not think that Brando's dismissal of them was an act of abandonment. Instead, it was as if they had been pardoned. Obviously, they did not have a good time under Lady White Mist. White Mist walked out of the cave and looked at the pirates from afar. Her eyes were full of pity. These people did not understand that sometimes freedom was not a good thing. However, becoming a nameless person could be considered a process of atonement for their past sins. From this point of view, it was not a bad thing. She came to Brando's side, and the Prime Minister's daughter, who was standing behind Brando, bent down and picked her up from the ground. She praised, "So elegant. White Mist snorted softly, "Humph, you don't have to deliberately flatter me. I need to find a backer or else Miss Medisha will always want to kill me." "She won't kill you. Don't think of everyone like you." She swore an oath of vengeance. "You asked for it. Doesn't Lady White Mist need a full-time servant?" White Mist sighed, "Do you know how to comb?" "A little. I have a cat at home." "Don't compare me to them, thank you. Don't cause too much trouble for Brando." "Why would I? I'm already his woman. That's one of the problems." The lady's voice replied in a bad mood. The march in the dark lasted for 2 days. It was the morning of the 3rd day when they left the underground caves of the pirate's lair. The size of the underground caves was beyond Brando's expectations. He even suspected that some areas in the depths of the caves might be connected to the beehive. The area of the underground world of Georgindy Ridge was not inferior to Wonde itself. It was normal for it to extend to both sides of the Tawu Strait. Unfortunately, no one could answer this question, and it was unlikely for him to verify it. The exit of the underground caves of the pirates' lair was located in a valley. In fact, the pirates rarely used this exit because it was too far away. The path here had not been used for many years, and it was occupied by a nest of giant spiders. Although these things did not cause any trouble for Brando, they frightened the women in the group. Other than Hippamera, even Medisha's face was a little ugly when they left the dark underground. Delphian, an ordinary person, was even paler, as if she was seriously ill. She had recovered from the injuries she suffered in the elemental frontier after becoming a card of fate, but now it was as if time had turned back. Chapter 1287. This situation continued until the end of their journey in the dark underground. At first, Brando had to take on the responsibility of carrying the Prime Minister's daughter forward. Delphian seemed to be grateful for this, but it was not long before her disguise was mercilessly exposed by Medisha. The Silver Elf Princess decisively lightened the burden of her lord and carried Delphian forward. But for some reason, the Prime Minister's daughter's expression seemed to become worse. Brando pretended not to see the open and covert struggle between the little princess and Delphian. When he led everyone out of the valley, he found that the entrance of the cave had been tightly sealed by the vegetation outside. So he had to pull out Odorfice to cut off the vines and pull them apart. Thousands of mottled insects of various colors scattered as if they were fleeing for their lives. The cave was filled with screams again. Only Huanghua bent down, picked up a beetle expressionlessly, and handed it to Hippamera behind her. "Thank you, Huanghua." Hippamera skillfully took out a bottle and put the beetle in. She now had 3 such bottles, 2 of which contained spiders and 1 of which contained her prawns. In short, the other ladies had kept a respectful distance from Miss Priestess and Huanghua. Fang Qi stood behind the ladies with a solemn face. Brando did not look at this scene. After he parted the grass, his face immediately became solemn. White Mist jumped down from Insursta's arms. Delphian, the incompetent maid, lost her sense of existence the next day because of the spiders. She walked out of the cave beside Brando's feet. She looked up and squinted her eyes. What both of them saw was a sky full of fog. Translator, Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. The fog from Towery Strait had exceeded everyone's imagination. On the map, they were already in the south of Soporake, in a valley about 100 miles away from the port. However, the visibility in the valley was less than 10 meters. Beyond 10 meters, it was a vast expanse of whiteness. Steep cliffs extended forward in the dense vegetation on both sides, vaguely revealing the outline of a valley. Insursta followed the 2 of them out. He saw the scene and shrugged and was about to say something. In fact, he had been voicing his opinion along the way. Compared to the taciturn Tarkus, this guy was simply a chatterbox. But Brando knew that this future star of Madara was just distracting him. Tarkus wanted him to go to Somia, and not Deadwater Bay or Manzola. He looked back at Tarkus, and the warning look in his eyes forced him to swallow his words. At this time there was a rustling sound from the grass, and Medisha, Tarkus, and Magadal also came out from behind Insursta. Brendel gestured for them to keep quiet, and then pointed to the front. Everyone saw that in the dense fog in front of them, there was a group of people and horses moving forward. It was a vast expanse of white, like ghosts, moving silently and unsteadily. Even though they were only a dozen meters away, no one turned back to look at them. Everyone suddenly felt the hair on their body stand up, including Insursta and Tarkus. No one in the world did not feel the mystery and fear of the lost names. Brando motioned for the others to return to the cave, and then he took a look at the long line of lost names and followed them back. The situation in the valley could be said to be both unexpected and within his expectations. Otherwise, he would not have insisted on finding the pirate's lair. Marching in the dark was boring, but it helped them a lot. From the area of Sopalach Fjord to the nearby inland area, it was all rugged mountain roads. They could not move faster than the spreading fog, and it was hopeless to think about walking more than 100 miles under these messy things. But he was a little surprised that the fog could spread so quickly inland. He asked the White Fog Lady's advice for insurance, but he did not expect it to be a prophecy. Now it seemed that he really had to consider the possibility of going deep into the fog. What should we do? Insursta saw him coming back, and after a long time he choked out this sentence. Brando shook his head. There were only two possibilities in front of him. The best choice was undoubtedly to go west to the port cities of Deadwater Bay or Manzola, so that they could keep parallel to the direction of the army of the lost names and avoid running into the center of the fog. Then they could also take a ship from Manzola or Deadwater Bay, and it would be convenient for them to go to Erewhon or Phoenix Fire and return to the Green Jade Hill. But there was a huge problem here, that was, they did not know the current situation of Manzola and Deadwater Bay. Had it become the same situation as Gusel and Sopalach there? Was there the same fog on the sea? No one could say for sure. The other way was to go north and enter places like Somia or the Bone Dragon Cliff as Insursta and the others hoped. The former was the hometown of the skeleton Lord Cabias, who he killed in Castle Abes, and was one of Madara's largest territories in the south of the Sea of the Dying Moon. The latter was said to have a bone dragon tomb, but unfortunately, because it was a forbidden zone for players, it had always been a rumor. Both of these places were deep in the hinterland of Madara. Insursta and Tarkus originally wanted him to choose this path because it was actually the only way to cross Madara by land. If they took this path, then going to the realm of eternal death would be an inevitable choice. And if he chose to take a ship from Deadwater Bay or Manzola to Erewhon, the other party's plan would obviously be in vain. But now, even Tarkus and Insursta, who were most eager for Brando to choose this path, had to carefully consider whether taking this path would lead them to encounter the army of the lost names, and what would happen after that no one could say for sure. And Brando also knew that if the white fog was not wrong, the crystal clusters seemed to be attacking Madara in this direction. In other words, if he chose this path he might really have to go to the battlefield. Brando opened the map, and Delphian immediately took the turpentine torch from the skeleton soldier beside her, supported herself against the wall, and went over to illuminate the former. Brando looked up at her, and the pale face of the Prime Minister's daughter was covered with fine beads of sweat. He shook his head and felt that Delphian did not have to do this at all, but she seemed to be deliberately trying to torture him. With this thought in mind he looked at the map carefully. Although he did listen to the White Fog Lady's advice, it meant that they had to plunge into the fog without a clue. The White Fog Lady only asked him to see the war between the crystal clusters and the undead, not to let them face the lost names head-on. This was obvious. If they could avoid it, of course it was best to avoid it. Which path? He asked. Somia. It was Delphian who answered him. Brendel raised his head and looked at the Prime Minister's daughter. From her light purple eyes, he could tell what she was thinking. She still had not given up on that thing, the mystery of the emerald, even under such circumstances. Although he always knew that the other party was almost unreasonable in her bigotry, the resolute answer of the Prime Minister's daughter still gave him a different kind of shock. In a sense, this could be said to be madness, but it also had a different kind of charm. Is it in that place? This time it was Medisha who spoke. The little silver elf princess stared at Delphian with her silver eyes. Her serious expression was the same as when she argued with the Prime Minister's daughter in Rushta. In this world, other than his own life, Brando had never hidden anything from four people, and that was the Roman, Allium Japonicum, Medisha, and Amandina. The former fled with him from Bucci, and was the first woman he saw when he came to this world. She had always been the most tolerant of him, and her position in his heart was even higher than his mother in this world. In this aspect, the war goddess' position in Brando's heart was slightly inferior. Although they had gone through thick and thin together, Brando's impression of Freya was more of a pity. He did not want the war goddess of Erewhon to walk down the same path again in the future, and this was very similar to his hope for Princess Griffin. Although he could feel the feelings from the girl in Bucci, and also understood her trust in him, Freya was too serious and resolute, and some things were not suitable for him to say to her. Just like how he felt about Erewhon, the princess and the royal faction, he did not tell her everything. As for Allium Japonicum, there was no need to say much. In this world, perhaps the only person who understood him the most was the female knight from the Grey Mountain, and the other soul in her body. The latter had always been the commander of his subordinates, and Amandina could be said to be his most trusted aide. Since the establishment of Abes, most of his plans were carried out by the two of them, so he would not hide any details of his plans from the two ladies. Therefore he had also told Medisha about the mystery of the Emerald Heart early in the morning, and this matter was related to a small episode that he regretted a lot. That was when he told Medisha about the details of the Emerald Heart. He accidentally let the latter beat around the bush and told her that he was tricked into bed by Delphian with Hofward's golden wine. Brando could swear that he never thought that the Silver Elf Princess would have so many thoughts, and he thought that she was just asking a routine question. In the end, he did not even know what he had said, but Medisha had already guessed the whole story thoroughly. In fact, he had already begun to suspect that Medisa and her sister weren't half-sisters at all. Instead, they were a pair of biological sisters. Chapter 1288. I promise, Delphian replied, I won't miscalculate. I believe you, but do you understand the cost of deceiving me and the Lord? Medisha replied. Delphian glanced at the spear in the Silver Elf Princess' hand, then looked up into her mercury-like eyes. Threats are meaningless to me, Miss Medisha. What the Lord needs is my wholehearted loyalty. She deliberately emphasized wholeheartedly. Medisha blushed slightly. She turned around and rolled her eyes at Brando. Brando suddenly felt a little baffled. Insursta and Tarkus pretended that they did not hear him. Even though they knew that Brendel was determined to infiltrate Madara's territory and probably had some sort of plan, they were both cautious and intelligent people, and naturally knew how to protect themselves. As for Fang Qi and the other two Phantom Chariot elders, Brando and Medisha naturally used crews when they talked so they could not understand. After the plan was set, the next step was to put it into action. Insursta and Tarkus had no objections to this. After all, they were still prisoners in name, but in fact, this team was decided by Brando most of the time. As Brando's student, Phoenix Fire was even less likely to object. As for the Phantom Chariot gang, they were the captives of the captives. The two elders and Fang Qi had no right to speak in this team. At most, they could add in the opinions of Medisha and Lady White Fog, but Lady White Fog usually did not have any opinions, so if Medisha agreed to something, it would most likely be the final result. However, the Silver Elf Princess did not recklessly let the team go immediately. Adhering to the natural meticulousness and rigor of the Silver Elves, she arranged the departure time after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, when the sun was at its brightest on both sides of the Tawu Strait, and when the fog was at its thinnest. Brando knew that the power of the war slate was at its peak during this period, and the power of order that shrouded both sides of the strait was at its most stable. Perhaps it was because of Medisha's meticulousness, or because of good luck, they did not encounter any trouble along the way. They arrived at Tormlo at 10 o'clock in the evening of the first day, which was the place where Exion and Phoenix Fire had stopped. If that piece of broken wall was really Tormelos. This was once the most prosperous town on the Black Road between Rosaline and Sopa Latch, but now it was a scene of devastation. A war seemed to have swept through this place not long ago, leaving behind only ruins. The battlefield was full of corpses of the Crystal Cluster monsters and humans. The Crystal Cluster had erected a forest of crystal spears in the middle of the ruins of the town, and the spears were densely packed with human corpses. It was like a bloody and terrifying slaughterhouse, and it was nauseating. Princess Magadal immediately turned her head and vomited, but the rest of the ladies, including Hippamera and Phoenix Fire, were very calm. Brando was a little surprised by his student's reaction. He could feel the anger in her heart, but it was not fear or fear. Aliens. She squeezed out 2 words from between her teeth. That night, Medisha arranged for the whole team to set up camp near Tormlo. Although they could not accept it psychologically, they understood that it was the best choice. The Crystal Cluster monsters were not interested in occupying the town, so it was probably the safest choice to stay in a town that they had already swept through. However, at the end of the day when they were doing a head count, Brando and Medisha realized that a few of the Ghost Chariot sailors were missing. These people had sneaked away or disappeared for some other reason. Brando could not guess and could only ask Delphian to think of a way to keep a closer watch on these people. The Prime Minister's daughter was quite talented in this aspect, and she quickly passed this job to the skeletons of Madara and the Ghost Chariot sailors. Before the sky was completely dark, she had already arranged everything in an orderly manner. Her method was very simple. She just had to sit together and supervise each other, plus some small tricks. Classic methods were often simple and practical because they were often tested by time. The flickering light of the bonfire soon lit up the dark wilderness. The stars and the moon in the sky could not be seen in the fog. The fog surged in the darkness, revealing its shape at the edge of the bonfire, making it even more eerie and terrifying. After a simple dinner, Brando called Huang Hua to him. He decided to teach his new student something for the first time. He did not know how long Huang Hua would be able to learn from him. After all, she would eventually return to the Nine Phoenix. He could only try his best to help her find the most suitable path for herself in the limited time he had. The bonfire lit up Huang Hua's dark eyes. She was dressed in a neat training suit, holding her sword. She came to Brando and bowed respectfully as a disciple of the Nine Phoenix. "Teacher, Miss Medisha." Medisha stood behind Brando and looked at the little girl. She also liked the Lord's new student very much, perhaps because she saw her own shadow in her. Brando also looked at his student. Except for Petit Finus, his two students in this world shared some excellent characteristics: seriousness and respect for teachers. This was a very good era. Everyone understood the importance of knowledge and inheritance, so they cherished every hard-won opportunity. Even people like Haruz and Huang Hua, who were of noble birth, valued teachers like Brando more. It was definitely not easy to gain the favor of a sword saint, even for the royal family. However, Huang Hua and Haruz were different. Although Haruz was a boy, he did not have the strong aura of Huang Hua. Therefore, he was not suitable to be a swordsman at all. A mage was his best choice. As for Huang Hua, Brando knew at first glance that this little girl would be his successor. He even had a premonition that one day the battle style that he inherited from the players would be passed down by this little girl. That was the style of a top warrior. Brando knew that he was never the top warrior. Perhaps one day Huang Hua would go further than him on this path. But that was a matter for a long time. Right now, even a genius had to take one step at a time. "Huang Hua, have you ever used a weapon other than a sword?" "No, teacher." "Then I'll let Medisha test your limits first. Is that okay?" "Yes, teacher." The battle between Huang Hua and Medisha ended quickly. After the battle with Rushta, the Silver Elf Princess's speed of improvement was somewhat beyond Brando's expectations. Although she was cautious and held back, Brando could see that her strength had reached the peak of the law realm. However, Medisha did not use the power of the law to suppress Huang Hua. She knew what her lord was thinking. She used the simplest battle technique to force Huang Hua to abandon her sword. This was purely a difference in battle experience. The Silver Elves had hundreds of years of battle experience in the War of the Holy Saints. In addition, as the commander of the Elven Imperial Guard, Medisha's combat ability was not inferior to Brando's. In terms of battle experience, no one under Brando, including Brando, could surpass the two of them. Huang Hua looked at her sword in a daze. Although she already knew the difference between her and Brando, she did not expect the elven girl beside her teacher to be so powerful. In terms of appearance, Medisha did not seem much older than her. She suddenly felt a little disappointed. Although she wasn't discouraged, her confidence was shaken by the fact that she had fallen from the clouds from her usual self-perception of being a genius. Brendel furrowed his brows. He could see that Huang Hua was a bit distracted. Otherwise, even if Medisha could defeat her, it would not be so easy. As a teacher, he had always been straightforward. "What's wrong? Are you not focused enough?" Huang Hua immediately looked regretful. "I'm sorry, teacher." Brando waved his hand and said solemnly, "Everyone has a bad time. I'm not blaming you, but you have to adjust your mentality. Do you understand? Don't be too discouraged. Medisha looks only a bit older than you, but she's an elf. Her situation is a bit special. At your age, she's already experienced hundreds of battles." "I understand, teacher." Huang Hua replied respectfully. Brando turned his head and looked at Medisha. He did not let Medisha fight with Huang Hua to hurt his student's confidence. He was not that shallow. Moreover, he knew how outstanding his student was. She would not be arrogant because of her talent. Medisha met her lord's gaze. She hesitated and said, "Huang Hua is not suitable to use a sword. It's not that she's restricted by the sword. It's that the sword is restricting her." "The sword is restricting me?" Huang Hua was taken aback. She looked up at Medisha and her teacher. It was rare for her to be in a daze. She was a bit cute. To be exact, it's the things you learned that are restricting you. I heard from the Lord that the sword of Hellfire Red Lotus that you practice is one of the best sword techniques in the Nine Phoenixes. However, because this sword technique is too outstanding, it's restricting your imagination and talent. The more powerful a sword technique is, the more the person who learns it will rely on it. I know some of the secret sword techniques of the Silver Elves. The descendants who practice it are often worse than the previous generation. Those who are extremely talented are often burdened by the inheritance and cannot open up their own path. That's the situation, Medisha answered seriously. Chapter 1289. Brando looked at Medisha and couldn't help but chuckle. In terms of battle techniques, he really couldn't compare to this little princess. The path of a player was actually unorthodox because the system provided convenience for the players. Players only needed to find their own style through battle. However, in terms of more formal inheritance and battle knowledge, he was at most an amateur compared to Medisha, who was trained in the forbidden grounds of the Silver Elves. In fact, it was precisely because of this that he had considered teaching Huanghua after meeting Medisa. He wanted to avoid misleading her. When old Marshal Frank heard Medisha's words, he was so shocked that he almost jumped up. "You are a silver elf?" Magadol was shocked and quickly pulled her grandfather back, afraid that he would be too agitated and lose the dignity of the Antibureau family. "I am a silver elf, Mr. Frank. However, I no longer have any contact with the silver elves. I am the retainer of the Lord, and the captain of his guards," Medisha answered politely. The old marshal couldn't help but look at Brando with admiration. The silver elves were once the staunchest allies of the humans. They were also the guardians of the kingdom of Erewhon. However, because of the dispute between the House of Covardo and the House of Cipher, the silver elves left behind in Erewhon no longer interfered with the internal affairs of the kingdom. "I never thought that I would be able to see you again in my lifetime." "That is because our lord is outstanding enough. The silver elves made an agreement with King Gatl because we believe that King Gatl is an indomitable and trustworthy hero. It is the same for our lord." Brando was a little embarrassed. "Medisha, you are exaggerating. How can I be compared to the Flame King?" The silver elf princess only smiled. "The Flame King has also gained the recognition of Oderfeis." Brando was speechless. He suddenly appeared, and this little princess was at least 10 times better than Kargleis and Odom when it came to flattery. However, Huanghua seemed to be in deep thought after hearing Medisha's words. Just as the former said, she practiced the Red Lotus Sword of the 9 Phoenixes' 3 great swords. She was also proud of being a member of the Jade Phoenix family. She wanted to become a true powerhouse so that she could live up to her reputation of being a genius and the supreme swordsmanship that she learned. However, Medisha's words were like a bolt of lightning that pierced her heart. The situation she described was very similar to the history of the Jade Phoenix. Many generations of geniuses, but none of them were as talented as the 9 Phoenixes' ancestors. They were all bound to this supreme swordsmanship, and they had never thought of surpassing the realm of this swordsmanship. Of swordsman's level. Medisha looked at the little girl who stood there frowning, as if she had fallen into her own world. She turned around and said to Brando, "Huanghua is very talented. She has not gone down the wrong path. She just has not thought of her own path yet. It would be easier if she was in our family. I can ask the elders to use the Transcendence Key to release her power and let her know the path that is most suitable for her." "There is such a thing in the Silver Elves?" Medisha nodded. Brando was suddenly a little envious. The Silver Folk were indeed the Silver Folk. The Bugas also had their own way of cultivating their younger generation of wizards. Their wizard apprentices could be said to be the best in the world, and their success rate was very high. The reason was that the Bugas had something called the White Tower. The White Tower of the Bugas was not only a world-famous library, but it was also similar to the White Tower in the law realm. It allowed people to personally comprehend the power of the law from above. This was because they could have such an experience under elemental energy. Compared to the bitter human wizard apprentices, the Bugas' path as a wizard was naturally much smoother and happier. As a fighting race of the Silver Folk, the Silver Elves naturally had something similar. This kind of sacred object that could let people release their power was even more incredible than the White Tower. What was releasing power? It was actually the process of releasing one's instincts and combat intuition. In his past life, the players had to wait until the middle to late Second Era, when they used the War Slate to simulate and perfect the body's law before they gradually began to come into contact with this field. Before that, almost all the warrior players used this ability passively. This led to some people having high talent and some people having low talent. Brendel was a middle to upper class warrior, and in terms of using his intuition to fight, he was actually far inferior to those who stood at the top of the player world. However, once this thing was mastered, it would become the body's most instinctive memory and even integrate into the soul. The reason why Brando was so clear about this was because this wealth from the previous world had been of great help to him ever since he transmigrated to this world. This was the so-called combat experience. Most warriors, before exploring their own talent and power, did not understand what was the most suitable fighting style for them. Just like Huang Hua at this moment, but her talent was also outstanding. She could actually understand her own shortcomings from Brando's fighting style. This was in fact the reason why Brando wanted to make this little girl his student. I have an idea. Brando thought for a while and replied, but I need your help, Medisha. My lord, please tell me. The way we humans release power is different from you. The power of a warrior is dominated by rage and wildness, so we believe that when a person fights based on instinct, he will be able to find the most suitable fighting style for himself. Guide anger? Medisha was a little surprised. Humans have mastered such a brilliant method in the past 1,000 years? This requires a considerable understanding of the law and the soul, right? She subconsciously looked at Brando. Brando immediately knew that things were not going well. The old marshal frowned. In fact, the human world did not have such a method. Before the year of the sparks, there was only one way for human warriors to train their fighting instincts, and that was to repeatedly fight. Brando, like Brando, naturally had unparalleled fighting instincts and experience after hundreds of battles. However, this method was actually quite backward. It had existed since the beginning of mortals learning to fight, and could be said to be the fighting style of beasts. Until the Third Holy War, humans still relied on this primitive method. Fortunately, the old marshal had been away from Wone for half a century, and he was not sure if the Holy Cathedral of Fire or the other major holy cathedrals had come up with new methods in the past few decades. He only frowned and did not express any opinions. This gave Brando a chance to cover up his lie. His method was, of course, summed up by this system. In fact, it was also a method that existed in the Amber Sword for the convenience of the players. This method was shown in the game as a quest called Guide Anger. It was similar to the Elemental Activation quest, but only warriors could receive it. The process of completing this quest was the process of guiding anger. The chain of quests was done very well, and even received praise from the players at the time. However, Brando still felt a little strange when he thought about it. He always felt that he had learned something in the chain of quests. Otherwise, he would not have been able to directly apply his combat experience in the game after transmigrating. Of course, this was not what he needed to think about now, but how to simulate the method in the game. In fact, since he had spoken, he already had a plan in mind. Fortunately, in this world he also had the system. So he continued to say to Medisha, talk to Huang Hua first. She's a little uneasy today. I think it has something to do with those monsters. Ask her what's going on. My method was actually developed by the Highland Knight. It's not mature enough, I have to prepare. Medisha glanced at him, and the look in her eyes made Brando feel that he had been exposed. However, since Medisha did not speak, he naturally would not admit anything and could only keep his mouth shut. I understand, my lord. Then I'll leave it to you. You can practice more with Huang Hua and find out where her limits are. I have high hopes for her. She might become the future sage of the Nine Phoenix. Is the sage coming again? Medisha heard this and was slightly surprised. Maybe in Wonde, a new sage has been born. After handing Huang Hua to Medisha, Brando left the camp alone. This did not mean that he was irresponsible, but teaching Huang Hua was not something that could be done overnight. Although he tried to save time, it was not something that could be done in a day or two. In terms of expertise, it was better to leave it to the Silver Elf Princess. As for the things that he knew, it would not be too late to slowly teach them to Huang Hua after she found her own path. This was not something that could be rushed. For now, letting Medisha and Huang Hua familiarize themselves with each other was a good thing for both sides. After all, in his mind, the Silver Elf Princess had to take on half of the responsibility of a teacher. He quickly buried this question in the depths of his thoughts and began to think about the next step in the dark. With this thought in mind, he subconsciously walked toward another bonfire in front of him. The two bonfires were quite a distance away from each other in the darkness, and it was so dark that he could not even see his own fingers in front of him. When he approached the bonfire, he stopped in his tracks. He saw Delphian sitting beside the tent. The bonfire made her face red. The daughter of the Prime Minister buried her head in writing and drawing, as if she was calculating something. Brando paused for a moment and then silently walked over. You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.